So that was at the bottom of the whole business. And thus was the anonymous campaign of Herr Brentano * in the Concordia gloriously reflected in the imagination of the producers' co-operatives of Cambridge. There he stood, sword in hand, and thus he battled, in his masterly conduct of the attack, this St. George of the Association of German Manufacturers, while the infernal dragon Marx, in deadly shifts, speedily, breathed his last at his feet. A battle scene worthy of Ariosto. But the whole thing only served to conceal the further dodges of our St. George. Here there is no longer talk of lying insertion or falsification, but of craftily isolated quotation. The whole issue was shifted, and St. George and his Cambridge shield-bearer were very well aware why they had done this. Eleanor Marx replied in the Monthly Journal today, February 1884, as the Times refused to publish her letter. She once more focused the debate on the sole question at issue: had Marx lyingly inserted that sentence or not? To this Mr. Sedley Taylor answered that the question whether a particular sentence did or Lujo Brentano, 1844–1931, professorial socialist, founder of the Verein für Sozialpolitik, liberal advocate of social reform, and professor at various German universities from 1872 until 11914. Preface to the 4th edition 119 did not occur in Mr. Gladstone's speech, had been, in his opinion, of very subordinate importance, in the Brentano-Marx controversy, compared to the issue whether the quotation in dispute was made with the intention of conveying, or of perverting Mr. Gladstone's meaning. He then admits that the report in the Times contained a verbal contrariety, but, if the context is rightly interpreted, in the Gladstonian liberal sense, it shows what Mr. Gladstone meant to say, today, March 1884. The most comic point here is that our little Cambridge man now insists upon quoting the speech not from Hansard, as, according to the anonymous Brentano, it is customary to do, but from the report in the Times, which the same Brentano had characterized as of necessity botched. Naturally so, for in Hansard the vexatious sentence is missing. Eleanor Marx had no difficulty, in the same issue of today, in dissolving all this argumentation into thin air. Either Mr. Taylor had read the controversy of 1872, in which case he was now mocking not only lying insertions but also lying suppressions, or he had not read it and ought to remain silent. In either case it was certain that he did not dare for a moment to maintain the accusation of his friend Brentano that Marx had made a lying addition. On the contrary, Marx, it now seems, had not lyingly added but suppressed an important sentence. But this same sentence is quoted on page 5 of the inaugural address, a few lines before the alleged lying insertion, asterisk, and as to the contrariety in Gladstone's speech, is it not Marx himself who refers in capital, page 806, note 40, to the continual crying contradictions in Gladstone's budget speeches of 1863 and 1864. Only he does not venture, a la Sedley Taylor, to resolve them into complacent liberal sentiments. Eleanor Marx, in concluding her reply, sums up as follows: Marx has not suppressed anything worth quoting, neither has he, lyingly, added anything. But he has restored, rescued from oblivion, a particular sentence of one of Mr. Gladstone's speeches, a sentence which had indubitably been pronounced, but which somehow or other had found its way out of Hansard. With that, Mr. Sedley Taylor too had had enough, and the result of this whole professorial cobweb, spun out over to Karl Marx, op. cit. The sentence is this: the average condition of the British laborer has improved to a degree we know to be extraordinary and unexampled in the history of any country or any age. 120 Preface to the 4th edition Decades and Two Great Countries, is that nobody has since dared to cast any other aspersion upon Marx's literary honesty, while Mr. Sedley Taylor, no doubt, will after this put as little confidence in the literary war bulletins of Herr Brentano as Herr Brentano will in the papal infallibility of Hansard. Frederick Engels, London, the 25th of June 1890. This was not in fact the end of this controversy. Brentano came back into the fray once again, which led Engels to publish a more comprehensive refutation of Brentano's charges, with all the documents concerned appended in pamphlet form. Brentano contra Marx, reprinted in Mu 22. Capital. V. Volume 1. Part 1. Commodities and Money. Chapter 1. The Commodity. The two factors of the commodity. Use value and value, substance of value, magnitude of value. The wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as an immense collection of commodities. 1. The individual commodity appears as an elementary form. Our investigation therefore begins with the analysis of the commodity. The commodity is, first of all, an external object, a thing which through its qualities satisfies human needs of whatever kind. The nature of these needs, whether they arise, for example, from the stomach or the imagination, makes no difference. 2. Nor does it matter here how the thing satisfies man's need, whether directly as a means of subsistence, i.e. an object of consumption, or indirectly as a means of production. Every useful thing, for example, iron, paper, etc., may be looked at from the 2 points of view of quality and quantity. Every useful thing is a whole composed of many properties, it can therefore be useful in various ways. The discovery of these ways and hence of the manifold uses of things is the work of history. 3. So also is the invention of socially recognized standards of measure meant for the quantities of these useful objects. The diversity of the one. Karl Marx, Zur Kritik der politischen Ökonomie, Berlin, 1859, page 3. English translation, page 27, 2. Desire implies want. It is the appetite of the mind, and as natural as hunger to the body. The greatest number of things have their value from supplying the wants of the mind. Nicholas Barbon, A Discourse on Coining the New Money Lighter. In answer to Mr. Locke's Considerations, etc., London, 1696, pp. 2, 3, 3. Things have an intrinsic virtue. This is Barbon's special term for use value, which in all places have the same virtue, as the lodestone to attract iron, op. Cit. Page 6. The magnet's property of attracting iron only became useful once it had led to the discovery of magnetic polarity. 126 Commodities and money measures for commodities arises in part from the diverse nature of the objects to be measured, and in part from convention. The usefulness of a thing makes it a use value. 4. But this usefulness does not dangle in midair. It is conditioned by the physical properties of the commodity, and has no existence apart from the latter. It is therefore the physical body of the commodity itself, for instance iron, a diamond, which is the use value or useful thing. This property of a commodity is independent of the amount of labor required to appropriate its useful qualities. When examining use values, we always assume we are dealing with definite quantities, such as dozens of watches, yards of linen, or tons of iron. The use values of commodities provide the material for a special branch of knowledge, namely the commercial knowledge of commodities. Use values are only realized, verwerklicht, in use or in consumption. They constitute the material content of wealth, whatever its social form may be. In the form of society to be considered here, they are also the material bearers, Träger, of exchange value. Exchange value appears first of all as the quantitative relation, the proportion, in which use values of one kind exchange for use values of another kind. 6. This relation changes constantly with time and place. Hence exchange value appears to be something accidental and purely relative, and consequently an intrinsic value, i.e. an exchange value that is inseparably connected with the commodity, inherent in it, seems a contradiction in terms. 7. Let us consider the matter more closely. 4. The natural worth of anything consists in its fitness to supply the needs of cities, or serve the conveniences of human life. John Locke. Some consider Tions on the consequences of the lowering of interest, 1691, in Works, London, 1777, Volume 2, page 28. In English writers of the 17th century we still often find the word worth used for use value and value for exchange value. This is quite in accordance with the spirit of a language that likes to use a Teutonic word for the actual thing, and a Romance word for its reflection. In bourgeois society the legal fiction prevails that each person, as a buyer, has an encyclopedic knowledge of commodities. 6. Value consists in the exchange relation between one thing and another, between a given amount of one product and a given amount of another. Latron, De l'intérêt social, in Physiocrates, ed. Dyra, Paris, 1846, page 889, 7. Nothing can have an intrinsic value. N. Barbon, op. Cit. Page 6, or as Butler says, the value of a thing is just as much as it will bring. Samuel Butler, Hudibras, Part 2, Canto 1, lines 465-6, for what is worth in anything, but so much money as 'twill bring. The commodity 127. A given commodity, a quarter of wheat for example, is exchanged for X boot polish, Y silk or Z gold, etc. In short, it is exchanged for other commodities in the most diverse proportions. Therefore the wheat has many exchange values instead of one. But X boot polish, Y silk or Z gold, etc., each represent the exchange value of one quarter of wheat. Therefore X boot polish, Y silk, Z gold, etc., must, as exchange values, be mutually replaceable or of identical magnitude. It follows from this that, firstly, the valid exchange values of a particular commodity express something equal, and secondly, exchange value cannot be anything other than the mode of expression, the form of appearance, asterisk of a content distinguishable from it. Let us now take two commodities, for example corn and iron. Whatever their exchange relation may be, it can always be represented by an equation in which a given quantity of corn is equated to some quantity of iron, for instance I quarter of corn equals XCWT of iron. What does this equation signify? It signifies that a common element of identical magnitude exists in two different things, in I quarter of corn and similarly in XCWT of iron. Both are therefore equal to a third thing, which in itself is neither the one nor the other. Each of them, so far as it is exchange value, must therefore be reducible to this third thing. A simple geometrical example will illustrate this. In order to determine and compare the areas of all rectilinear figures we split them up into triangles. Then the triangle itself is reduced to an expression totally different from its visible shape, half the product of the base and the altitude. In the same way the exchange values of commodities must be reduced to a common element, of which they represent a greater or lesser quantity. This common element cannot be a geometrical, physical, chemical or other natural property of commodities. Such proper ties come into consideration only to the extent that they make the commodities useful, i.e. turn them into use values. But clearly, the exchange relation of commodities is characterized precisely by its abstraction from their use values. Within the exchange relation, one use value is worth just as much as another, provided only that it is present in the appropriate quantity. Or, as old Barbon says, one sort of wares are as good as another, if the value be equal. There is no difference or distinction in things of equal value. Erscheinungsform. This word appears in inverted commas in the original. 128 commodities and money. 100 pounds worth of lead or iron is of as great a value as 100 pounds worth of silver and golds as use values. Commodities differ above all in quality, while as exchange values they can only differ in quantity, and therefore do not contain an atom of use value. If then we disregard the use value of commodities, only one property remains, that of being products of labor. But even the product of labor has already been transformed in our hands. If we make abstraction from its use value, we abstract also from the material constituents and forms which make it a use value. It is no longer a table, a house, a piece of yam, or any other useful thing. All its sensuous characteristics are extinguished. Nor is it any longer the product of the labor of the joiner, the mason, or the spinner, or of any other particular kind of productive labor. With the disappearance of the useful character of the products of labor, the useful character of the kinds of labor embodied in them also appears. This in turn entails the disappearance of the different concrete forms of labor. They can no longer be distinguished, but are altogether reduced to the same kind of labor, human labor in the abstract. Let us now look at the residue of the products of labor. There is nothing left of them in each case but the same phantom-like objectivity. They are merely congealed quantities of homogeneous human labor, i.e. of human labor power expended without regard to the form of its expenditure. All these things now tell us is that human labor power has been expended to produce them, human labor is accumulated in them. As crystals of this social substance, which is common to them, they are values. Commodity values, Warrenwerte. We have seen that when commodities are in the relation of exchange, their exchange value manifests itself as something totally independent of their use value. But if we abstract from their use value, there remains their value, as it has just been defined. The common factor in the exchange relation, or in the exchange value of the commodity, is therefore its value. The progress of the investigation will lead us back to exchange value as the necessary mode of expression, or form of appearance, of value. For the present, however, we must consider the nature of value independently of its form of appearance, Erscheinungsform. 8. N. Barbon, Op. Cit. pp. 53 and 7. The commodity 129 a use value, our useful article, therefore, has value only because abstract human labor is objectified, vergegenständigt, or materialized in it. How, then, is the magnitude of this value to be measured? By means of the quantity of the value forming substance, the labor, contained in the article. This quantity is measured by its duration, and the labor time is itself measured on the particular scale of hours, days, etc. It might seem that if the value of a commodity is determined by the quantity of labor expended to produce it, it would be the more valuable the more unskillful and lazy the worker who product it, because he would need more time to complete the article. However, the labor that forms the substance of value is equal human labor, the expenditure of identical human labor power. The total labor power of society, which is manifested in the values of the world of commodities, counts here as one homogeneous mass of human labor power, although composed of innumerable individual units of labor power. Each of these units is the same as any other, to the extent that it has the character of a socially average unit of labor power and acts as such, only needs, in order to produce a commodity, the labor time which is necessary on an average, or in other words is socially necessary. Socially necessary labor time is the labor time required to produce any use value under the conditions of production normal for a given society and with the average degree of skill and intensity of labor prevalent in that society. The introduction of power looms into England, for example, probably reduced by one-half the labor required to convert a given quantity of yarn into woven fabric. In order to do this, the English handloom weaver in fact needed the same amount of labor time as before, but the product of his individual hour of labor now only represented half an hour of social labor, and consequently fell to one-half its former value. What exclusively determines the magnitude of the value of any article is therefore the amount of labor socially necessary, or the labor time socially necessary for its production. 9. The individual 9. The value of them, the necessaries of life, when they are exchanged the one for another, is regulated by the quantity of labor necessarily required, and commonly taken in producing them. Some thoughts on the interest of money in general, and particularly in the public funds, London, pp. 36, 37. This remarkable anonymous work of the 18th century bears no date. However, it is clear from its contents that it appeared in the reign of George II, about 1739 or 1740. 130 commodities and money. Commodity counts here only as an average sample of its kind. Low commodities which contain equal quantities of labor, or which can be produced in the same time, have therefore the same value. The value of a commodity is related to the value of any other commodity as the labor time necessary for the production of the one is related to the labor time necessary for the production of the other. As exchange values, all commodities are merely definite quantities of congealed labor time. The value of a commodity would therefore remain constant, if the labor time required for its production also remained constant. But the latter changes with every variation in the productivity of labor. This is determined by a wide range of circumstances. It is determined amongst other things by the worker's average degree of skill, the level of development of science in its technological application, the social organization of the process of production, the extent and effectiveness of the means of production, and the conditions found in the natural environment. For example, the same quantity of labor is present in 8 bushels of corn in favorable seasons and in only 4 bushels in unfavorable seasons. The same quantity of labor provides more metal in rich mines than in poor. Diamonds are a very rare occurrence on the Earth's surface, and hence their discovery costs, on an average, a great deal of labor time. Consequently, much labor is represented in a small volume. Jacob questions whether gold has ever been paid for at its full value. This applies still more to diamonds. According to Eschwege, the total produce of the Brazilian diamond mines for the 80 years ending in 1823 still did not amount to the price of a year's average produce of the sugar and coffee plantations of the same country, although the diamonds represented much more labor, therefore more value. With richer mines, the same quantity of labor would be embodied in more diamonds, and their value would fall. If man succeeded, without much labor, in transforming carbon into diamonds, 10. Properly speaking, all products of the same kind form a single mass, and their price is determined in general and without regard to particular circumstances. Latrone, Op. Cit. Page 893, 11. Karl Marx, Op. Cit. Page 6. English translation, page 30. William Jacob, An Historical Enquiry into the Production and Consumption of the Precious Metals, London, 1831, Volume 2, page 101. This information comes from H. A. M. Merivale, Lectures on Colonization and Colonies, London, 1841. Cr. Grundrisse, page 833. The commodity 131 their value might fall below that of bricks. In general, the greater the productivity of labor, the less the labor time required to produce an article, the less the mass of labor crystallized in that article, and the less its value. Inversely, the less the productivity of labor, the greater the labor time necessary to produce an article, and the greater its value. The value of a commodity, therefore, varies directly as the quantity, and inversely as the productivity, of the labor which finds its realization within the commodity. Now we know the substance of value. It is labor. We know the measure of its magnitude. It is labor time. The form, which stamps value as exchange value, remains to be analyzed. But before this we need to develop the characteristics we have already found somewhat more fully. A thing can be a use value without being a value. This is the case whenever its utility to man is not mediated through labor. Air, virgin soil, natural meadows, unplanted forests, etc. fall into this category. A thing can be useful, and a product of human labor, without being a commodity. He who satisfies his own need with the product of his own labor admittedly creates use values, but not commodities. In order to produce the latter, he must not only produce use values, but use values for others, social use values. And not merely for others. The medieval peasant produced a corn rent for the feudal lord and a corn tithe for the priest, but neither the corn rent nor the corn tithe became commodities simply by being produced for others. In order to become a commodity, the product must be transferred to the other person, for whom it serves as a use value, through the medium of exchange. Finally, nothing can be a value without being an object of utility. If the thing is useless, so is the labor contained in it. The labor does not count as labor, and therefore creates no value. 2. The dual character of the labor embodied in commodities. Initially the commodity appeared to us as an object with a dual character, possessing both use value and exchange value. Later, the passage in parentheses occurs only in the first edition. Note by Engels to the fourth German edition. I have inserted the passage in parentheses because, through its omission, the misconception has very frequently arisen that Marx regarded every product consumed by someone other than the producer as a commodity. 132 commodities and money. On it was seen that labor, too, has a dual character. In so far as it finds its expression in value, it no longer possesses the same characteristics as when it is the creator of use values. I was the first to point out and examine critically this twofold nature of the labor contained in commodities. 12. As this point is crucial to an understanding of political economy, it requires further elucidation. Let us take two commodities, such as a coat and 10 yards of linen, and let the value of the first be twice the value of the second, so that, if 10 yards of linen equals W, the coat equals 2W. The coat is a use value that satisfies a particular need. A specific kind of productive activity is required to bring it into existence. This activity is determined by its aim, mode of operation, object, means and result. We use the abbreviated expression, useful labor, for labor whose utility is represented by the use value of its product, or by the fact that its product is a use value. In this connection we consider only its useful effect. As the coat and the linen are qualitatively different use values, so also are the forms of labor through which their existence is mediated. Tailoring and weaving. If the use values were not qualitatively different, hence not the products of qualitatively different forms of useful labor, they would be absolutely incapable of confronting each other as commodities. Coats cannot be exchanged for coats, one use value cannot be exchanged for another of the same kind. The totality of heterogeneous use values or physical commodities reflects a totality of similarly heterogeneous forms of useful labor, which differ in order, genus, species and variety, in short, a social division of labor. This division of labor is a necessary condition for commodity production, although the converse does not hold. Commodity production is not a necessary condition for the social division of labor. Labor is socially divided in the primitive Indian community, although the products do not thereby become commodities. Or, to take an example nearer home, labor is systematically divided in every factory, but the workers do not bring about this division by exchanging their individual products. Only the products of mutually independent acts of labor, performed in isolation, can confront each other as commodities. To sum up, then, the use value of every commodity contains 12. Karl Marx, Op. Cit. pp. 12, 13, and Passam, English translation, pp. 41, 42. The commodity 133 useful labor, i.e. productive activity of a definite kind, carried on with a definite aim. Use values cannot confront each other as commodities unless the useful labor contained in them is qualitatively different in each case. In a society whose products generally assume the form of commodities, i.e. in a society of commodity producers, this qualitative difference between the useful forms of labor which are carried on independently and privately by individual producers develops into a complex system, a social division of labor. It is moreover a matter of indifference whether the coat is worn by the tailor or by his customer. In both cases it acts as a use value. So, too, the relation between the coat and the labor that produced it is not in itself altered when tailoring becomes a special trade, an independent branch of the social division of labor. Men made clothes for thousands of years, under the compulsion of the need for clothing, without a single man ever becoming a tailor. But the existence of coats, of linen, of every element of material wealth not provided in advance by nature, had always to be mediated through a specific productive activity appropriate to its purpose, a productive activity that assimilated particular natural materials to particular human requirements. Labor, then, as the creator of use values, as useful labor, is a condition of human existence which is independent of all forms of society. It is an eternal natural necessity which mediates the metabolism between man and nature, and therefore human life itself. Use values like coats, linen, etc., in short, the physical bodies of commodities, are combinations of two elements, the material provided by nature, and labor. If we subtract the total amount of useful labor of different kinds which is contained in the coat, the linen, etc., a material substratum is always left. This substratum is furnished by nature without human intervention. When man engages in production, he can only proceed as nature does herself, i.e. he can only change the form of the materials. 3. Furthermore, 13. All the phenomena of the universe, whether produced by the hand of man or indeed by the universal laws of physics, are not to be conceived of as acts of creation but solely as a reordering of matter. Composition and separation are the only elements found by the human mind whenever it analyzes the notion of reproduction, and so it is with the reproduction of value, use value, although Very himself, in this polemic against the physiocrats, is not quite certain of the kind of value he is referring to. And wealth, whether earth, air and water are turned into corn in the fields, or the secretions of an insect are turned into silk by the hand of man, or some small pieces of metal are 134 commodities and money. Even in this work of modification he is constantly helped by natural forces. Labor is therefore not the only source of material wealth, of the use values it produces. As William Petty says, labor is the father of material wealth, the earth is its mother. Let us now pass from commodity as an object of utility to the value of commodities. We have assumed that the coat is worth twice as much as the linen. But this is merely a quantitative difference and does not concern us at the moment. We shall therefore simply bear in mind that if the value of a coat is twice that of 10 yards of linen, 20 yards of linen will have the same value as a coat. As values, the coat and the linen have the same substance, they are the objective expressions of homogeneous labor. But tailoring and weaving are qualitatively different forms of labor. There are, however, states of society in which the same man alternately makes clothes and weaves. In this case, these two different modes of labor are only modifications of the labor of the same individual and not yet fixed functions peculiar to different individuals, just as the coat our tailor makes today, and the pair of trousers he makes tomorrow, require him only to vary his own individual labor. Moreover, we can see at a glance that in our capitalist society a given portion of labor is supplied alternately in the form of tailoring and in the form of weaving, in accordance with changes in the direction of the demand for labor. This change in the form of labor may well not take place without friction, but it must take place. If we leave aside the determinate quality of productive activity, and therefore the useful character of the labor, what remains is its quality of being an expenditure of human labor power. Tailoring and weaving, although they are qualitatively different productive activities, are both a productive expenditure of human brains, muscles, nerves, hands, etc., and in this sense both human labor. They are merely two different forms of the expenditure of human labor power. Of course, human labor power must itself arrange together to form a repeating watch. Pietro Verri, Meditazioni sulla economia politica, first printed in 1771. In Custodi's edition of the Italian Economists, Parti Moderna, Volume 15, pp. 21, 22. A Treatise of Taxes and Contributions, published anonymously by William Petty, London, 1667, page 47. The commodity 135 have attained a certain level of development before it can be expended in this or that form. But the value of a commodity represents human labor pure and simple, the expenditure of human labor in general. And just as, in civil society, a general or a banker plays a great part but man as such plays a very mean part, 14 so, here too, the same is true of human labor. It is the expenditure of simple labor power, of the labor power possessed in his bodily organism by every ordinary man, on the average, without being developed in any special way. Simple average labor, it is true, varies in character in different countries and at different cultural epochs, but in a particular society it is given. More complex labor counts only as intensified, or rather multiplied simple labor, so that a smaller quantity of complex labor is considered equal to a larger quantity of simple labor. Experience shows that this reduction is constantly being made. A commodity may be the outcome of the most complicated labor, but through its value it is posited as equal to the product of simple labor, hence it represents only a specific quantity of simple labor. The various proportions in which different kinds of labor are reduced to simple labor as their unit of measurement are established by a social process that goes on behind the backs of the producers. These proportions therefore appear to the producers to have been handed down by tradition. In the interests of simplification, we shall henceforth view every form of labor power directly as simple labor power. By this we shall simply be saving ourselves the trouble of making the reduction. Just as, in viewing the coat and the linen as values, we abstract from their different use values, so, in the case of the labor represented by those values, do we disregard the difference between its useful forms, tailoring and weaving. The use values coat and linen are combinations of, on the one hand, productive activity with a definite purpose, and, on the other, cloth and yarn. The values coat and linen, however, are merely congealed. 14. Cf. Hegel, Philosophie des Rechts, Berlin, 1840, page 250, para. 190. 15. The reader should note that we are not speaking here of the wages or value the worker receives for, e.g., a day's labor, but of the value of the commodity in which his day of labor is objectified. At this stage of our presentation, the category of wages does not exist at all. Hegel says here, in civil society as a whole, at the standpoint of needs, what we have before us is the composite idea which we call man. Thus this is the first time, and indeed the only time, to speak of man in this sense. Hegel's Philosophy of Right, Trail T.M. Knox, Oxford, 1952, page 127. 136 commodities and money quantities of homogeneous labor. In the same way, the labor contained in these values does not count by virtue of its productive relation to cloth and yam, but only as being an expenditure of human labor power. Tailoring and weaving are the formative elements in the use value coat and linen, precisely because these two kinds of labor are of different qualities, but only in so far as abstraction is made from their particular qualities, only in so far as both possess the same quality of being human labor, do tailoring and weaving form the substance of the values of the two articles mentioned. Coats and linen, however, are not merely values in general, but values of definite magnitude, and, following our assumption, the coat is worth twice as much as the 10 yards of linen. Why is there this difference in value? Because the linen contains only half as much labor as the coat, so that labor power had to be expended twice as long to produce the second as to produce the first. While, therefore, with reference to use value, the labor contained in a commodity counts only qualitatively, with reference to value it counts only quantitatively, once it has been reduced to human labor pure and simple. In the former case it was a matter of the how and the what of labor, in the latter of the how much of the temporal duration of labor. Since the magnitude of the value of a commodity represents nothing but the quantity of labor embodied in it, it follows that all commodities, when taken in certain proportions, must be equal in value. If the productivity of all the different sorts of useful labor required, let us say, for the production of a coat remains unchanged, the total value of the coats produced will increase along with their quantity. If one coat represents X days labor, 2 coats will represent 2X days labor, and so on. But now assume that the duration of the labor necessary for the production of a coat is doubled or halved. In the first case, 1 coat is worth as much as 2 coats were before. In the second case 2 coats are only worth as much as 1 was before, although in both cases 1 coat performs the same service, and the useful labor contained in it remains of the same quality. One change has taken place, however, a change in the quantity of labor expended to produce the article. In itself, an increase in the quantity of use values constitutes an increase in material wealth. 2 coats will clothe 2 men, 1 coat will only clothe 1 man, etc. Nevertheless, an increase in the commodity 137 amount of material wealth may correspond to a simultaneous fall in the magnitude of its value. This contradictory movement arises out of the twofold character of labor. By productivity, of course, we always mean the productivity of concrete useful labor. In reality, this determines only the degree of effectiveness of productive activity directed towards a given purpose within a given period of time. Useful labor becomes, therefore, a more or less abundant source of products in direct proportion as its productivity rises or falls. As against this, however, variations in productivity have no impact whatever on the labor itself represented in value. As productivity is an attribute of labor in its concrete useful form, it naturally ceases to have any bearing on that labor as soon as we abstract from its concrete useful form. The same labor, therefore, performed for the same length of time, always yields the same amount of value, independently of any variations in productivity. but it provides different quantities of use values during equal periods of time. More, if productivity rises, fewer, if it falls. For this reason, the same change in productivity which increases the fruitfulness of labor, and therefore the amount of use values produced by it, also brings about a reduction in the value of this increased total amount, if it cuts down the total amount of labor time necessary to produce the use values. The converse also holds. On the one hand, all labor is an expenditure of human labor power, in the physiological sense, and it is in this quality of being equal, or abstract, human labor that it forms the value of commodities. On the other hand, all labor is an expenditure of human labor power in a particular form and with a definite aim, and it is in this quality of being concrete useful labor that it produces use values. 1616. In order to prove that labor alone is the ultimate and real standard by which the value of all commodities can at all times and places be estimated and compared, Adam Smith says this: equal quantities of labor, at all times and places, must have the same value for the laborer. In his ordinary state of strength and activity, in the ordinary degree of his skill and dexterity, he must always lay down the same portion of his ease, his liberty, and his happiness. Wealth of Nations, BKI, ch. 5. pp. 104-5. On the one hand, Adam Smith here, but not everywhere, confuses his determination of value by the quantity of labor expended in the production of commodities with the determination of the values of commodities by the value of labor, and therefore endeavors to prove that equal quantities of labor always have the same. Here, as elsewhere occasionally, Marx quotes an English author in Gierman. This explains certain slight divergences from the original English text. 138 Commodities and Money 3. The value form. Or exchange version ALU commodities come into the world in the form of use values or material goods, such as iron, linen, corn, etc. This is their plain, homely, natural form. However, they are only commodities because they have a dual nature, because they are at the same time objects of utility and bearers of value. Therefore they only appear as commodities, or have the form of commodities, insofar as they possess a double form, natural form and value form. The objectivity of commodities as values differs from Dame Quickly in the sense that a man knows not where to have it. Not an atom of matter enters into the objectivity of commodities as values. In this it is the direct opposite of the coarsely sensuous objectivity of commodities as physical objects. We may twist and turn a single commodity as we wish, it remains impossible to grasp it as a thing possessing value. However, let us remember that commodities possess an objective character as values only insofar as they are all expressions of an identical social substance, human labor, that their objective character as values is therefore value. On the other hand, he has a suspicion that, insofar as labor manifests itself in the value of commodities, it only counts as an expenditure of labor power. But then again he views this expenditure merely as the sacrifice of rest, freedom and happiness, not as also man's normal life activity. Of course, he has the modern wage laborer in mind. Adam Smith's anonymous predecessor, cited in Note 9, is much nearer the mark when he says, "One man has employed himself a week in providing this necessary of life. And he that gives him some other in exchange, cannot make a better estimate of what is a proper equivalent, than by computing what cost him just as much labor and time, which in effect is no more than exchanging one man's labor in one thing for a time certain, for another man's labor in another thing for the same time. Some thoughts on the interest of money in general, etc., page 39. Note by Engels to the 4th German edition. The English language has the advantage of possessing two separate words for these two different aspects of labor. Labor which creates use values and is qualitatively determined is called work, as opposed to labor. Labor which creates value and is only may asserted quantitatively is called labor, as opposed to work, tt. Unfortunately, English usage does not always correspond to Engels' distinction. We have tried to adopt it where possible. Falstaff. Why, she's neither fish nor flesh. A man knows not where to have hr. Dame Quickly. Thou art an unjust man in saying so. Thou or any man knows where to have me, thou knave, thou. Henry IV, Part 1, Act 3, Scene 3. The commodity 139 purely social. From this it follows self-evidently that it can only appear in the social relation between commodity and commodity. In fact, we started from exchange value, or the exchange relation of commodities, in order to track down the value that lay hidden within it. We must now return to this form of appearance of value. Everyone knows, if nothing else, that commodities have a common value form which contrasts in the most striking manner with the motley natural forms of their use values. I refer to the money form. Now, however, we have to perform a task never even attempted by bourgeois economics. That is, we have to show the origin of this money form, we have to trace the development of the expression of value contained in the value relation of commodities from its simplest, almost imperceptible outline to the dazzling money form. When this has been done, the mystery of money will immediately disappear. The simplest value relation is evidently that of one commodity to another commodity of a different kind, it does not matter which one. Hence the relation between the values of two commodities supplies us with the simplest expression of the value of a single commodity. The simple, isolated, or accidental form of value x commodity A equals y commodity B, or x commodity A is worthy commodity B, 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, or 20 yards of linen are worth 1 coat, 1. The two poles of the expression of value. the relative form of value and the equivalent form. The whole mystery of the form of value lies hidden in this simple form. Our real difficulty, therefore, is to analyze it. Here two different kinds of commodities, in our example the linen and the coat, evidently play two different parts. The linen expresses its value in the coat. The coat serves as the material in which that value is expressed. The first commodity plays an active role, the second a passive one. The value of the first commodity is represented as relative value, in other words the commodity is in the relative form of value. The second commodity fulfills the function of equivalent, in other words it is in the equivalent form. The relative form of value and the equivalent form are two 140 commodities in money inseparable moments, which belong to and mutually condition each other. But, at the same time, they are mutually exclusive or opposed extremes, i.e. poles of the expression of value. They are always divided up between the different commodities brought into relation with each other by that expression. I cannot, for example, express the value of linen in linen. 20 yards of linen equals 20 yards of linen is not an expression of value. The equation states rather the contrary. 20 yards of linen are nothing but 20 yards of linen, a definite quantity of linen considered as an object of utility. The value of the linen can therefore only be expressed relatively, i.e. in another commodity. The relative form of the value of the linen therefore presupposes that some other commodity confronts it in the equivalent form. On the other hand, this other commodity, which figures as the equivalent, cannot simultaneously be in the relative form of value. It is not the latter commodity whose value is being expressed. It only provides the material in which the value of the first commodity is expressed. Of course, the expression 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, or 20 yards of linen are worth 1 coat, also includes its converse. 1 coat equals 20 yards of linen, or 1 coat is worth 20 yards of linen. But in this case I must reverse the equation, in order to express the value of the coat relatively. And, if I do that, the linen becomes the equivalent instead of the coat. The same commodity cannot, therefore, simultaneously appear in both forms in the same expression of value. These forms rather exclude each other as polar opposites. Whether a commodity is in the relative form or in its opposite, the equivalent form, entirely depends on its actual position in the expression of value. That is, it depends on whether it is the commodity whose value is being expressed, or the commodity in which value is being expressed. 2. The relative form of value. The content of the relative form of value. In order to find out how the simple expression of the value of a commodity lies hidden in the value relation between two commodities, we must, first of all, consider the value relation quite independently of its quantitative aspect. The usual mode of procedure is the precise opposite of this. Nothing is seen in the value relation but the proportion in which definite quantities of two sorts of commodity count as equal to each other. It is overlooked that the magnitudes of differ. The commodity 141 and things only become comparable in quantitative terms when they have been reduced to the same unit. Only as expressions of the same unit do they have a common denominator, and are therefore commensurable magnitudes. I7 Whether 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat or equals 20 coats or equals X coats, i.e. whether a given quantity of linen is worth few or many coats, it is always implied, whatever the proportion, that the linen and the coat, as magnitudes of value, are expressions of the same unit, things of the same nature. Linen equals coat is the basis of the equation. But these two qualitatively equated commodities do not play the same part. It is only the value of the linen that is expressed. And how? By being related to the coat as its equivalent, or, the thing exchangeable, with it. In this relation the coat counts as the form of existence of value, as the material embodiment of value, for only as such is it the same as the linen. On the other hand, the linen's own existence as value comes into view or receives an independent expression, for it is only as value that it can be related to the coat as being equal in value to it, or exchangeable with it. In the same way, butyric acid is a different substance from propylformate. Yet both are made up of the same chemical substances, carbon, C, hydrogen, H, and oxygen, 0. Moreover, these substances are combined together in the same proportions in each case, namely C4HSO2. If now butyric acid were to be equated with propylformate, then, in the first place, propylformate would count in this relation only as a form of existence of C4HSO2, and in the second place, it would thereby be asserted that butyric acid also consists of C4HSO2. Thus by equating propylformate with butyric acid one would be expressing their chemical composition as opposed to their physical formation. If we say that, as values, commodities are simply congealed quantities of human labor, our analysis reduces them, it is true, to the level of abstract value, but does not give them a form of value distinct from their natural forms. It is otherwise in the value relation of one commodity to another. The first commodities 17. The few economists, such as S. Bailey, who have concerned themselves with the analysis of the form of value have been unable to arrive at any result, firstly because they confuse the form of value with value itself, and secondly because, under the coarse influence of the practical bourgeois, they give their attention from the outset, and exclusively, to the quantitative aspect of the question. The command of quantity constitutes value, money and its vicissitudes, London, 1837, page 11. Written by S. Bailey. 142 Commodities and money value character emerges here through its own relation to the second commodity. By equating, for example, the coat as a thing of value to the linen, we equate the labor embedded in the coat with the labor embedded in the linen. Now it is true that the tailoring which makes the coat is concrete labor of a different sort from the weaving which makes the linen. That the act of equating tailoring with weaving reduces the former in fact to what is really equal in the two kinds of labor, to the characteristic they have in common of being human labor. This is a roundabout way of saying that weaving too, in so far as it weaves value, has nothing to distinguish it from tailoring, and, consequently, is abstract human labor. It is only the expression of equivalence between different sorts of commodities which brings to view the specific character of value-creating labor, by actually reducing the different kinds of labor embedded in the different kinds of commodity to their common quality of being human labor in general. I8 However, it is not enough to express the specific character of the labor which goes to make up the value of the linen. Human labor power in its fluid state, or human labor, creates value, but is not itself value. It becomes value in its coagulated state, in objective form. The value of the linen as a congealed mass of human labor can be expressed only as an objectivity, Gegenständigkeit, a thing which is materially different from the linen itself and yet common to the linen and all other commodities. The problem is already solved. When it is in the value relation with the linen, the coat counts qualitatively as the equal of the linen, it counts as a thing of the same nature, because it is a value. Here it is therefore a thing in 18. One of the first economists, after William Pett White to have seen through the nature of value, the famous Franklin, says this: trade in general being nothing else but the exchange of labor for labor, the value of all things is 0. Most justly measured by labor, the works of B. Franklin et Co. Edited by Sparks, Boston, 1836 Volume 2, page 267. Franklin is not aware that in measuring the value of everything, in labor, he makes abstraction from any difference in the kinds of labor exchanged, and thus reduces them all to equal human labor. Yet he states this without knowing it. He speaks first of the one labor, then of the other labor, and finally of labor without further qualification, as the substance of the value of everything. Sir William Petty, 1623–87, English economist and statistician. Regarded by Marx as the founder of modern political economy, see below, page 174, n. 34. Petty recognizes labor as the source of material wealth, but misapprehends the source of exchange value. Karl Marx, Op. Cit. pp. 52–4. The commodity 143 which value is manifested, or which represents value in its tangible natural form. Yet the coat itself, the physical aspect of the coat commodity, is purely a use value. A coat as such no more expresses value than does the first piece of linen we come across. This proves only that, within its value relation to the linen, the coat signifies more than it does outside it, just as some men count for more when inside a gold-braided uniform than they do otherwise. In the production of the coat, human labor power, in the shape of tailoring, has in actual fact been expended. Human labor has therefore been accumulated in the coat. From this point of view, the coat is a bearer of value, although this property never shows through, even when the coat is at its most threadbare. In its value relation with the linen, the coat counts only under this aspect, counts therefore as embodied value, as the body of value, word corpor. Despite its buttoned-up appearance, the linen recognizes in it a splendid kindred soul, the soul of value. Nevertheless, the coat cannot represent value towards the linen unless value, for the latter, simultaneously assumes the form of a coat. An individual, A, for instance, cannot be, Your Majesty, to another individual, B, unless Majesty in B's eyes assumes the physical shape of A, and, moreover, changes facial features, hair and many other things, with every new father of his people. Hence, in the value relation, in which the coat is the equivalent of the linen, the form of the coat counts as the form of value. The value of the commodity linen is therefore expressed by the physical body of the commodity coat, the value of one by the use value of the other. As a use value, the linen is something palpably different from the coat. As value, it is identical with the coat, and therefore looks like the coat. Thus the linen acquires a value form different from its natural form. Its existence as value is manifested in its equality with the coat, just as the sheep-like nature of the Christ Ian is shown in his resemblance to the Lamb of God. We see, then, that everything our analysis of the value of commodities previously told us is repeated by the linen itself, as soon as it enters into association with another commodity, the coat. Only it reveals its thoughts in a language with which it alone is familiar, the language of commodities. In order to tell us that labor creates its own value in its abstract quality of being human labor, it says that the coat, in so far as it counts as its equal, is value, consists of the same labor as it does itself. In order to 144 commodities and money inform us that its sublime objectivity as a value differs from its stiff and starchy existence as a body, it says that value has the appearance of a coat, and therefore that in so far as the linen itself is an object of value, wording, it and the coat are as like as two peas. Let us note, incidentally, that the language of commodities also has, apart from Hebrew, plenty of other more or less correct dialects. The German word, wertsein, to be worth, for instance, brings out less strikingly than the Romance verb, valer. That the equating of commodity B with commodity A is the expression of value proper to commodity A Paris vot bien un messa. By means of the value relation, therefore, the natural form of commodity B becomes the value form of commodity A, In other words, the physical body of commodity B becomes a mirrmirror for the value of commodity A. 19 Commodity A, then, in entering into a relation with commodity B as an object of value, Werkkörper, as a materialization of human labor, makes the use value B into the material through which its own value is expressed. The value of commodity A, thus expressed in the use value of commodity B, has the form of relative value. E. The quantitative determinacy of the relative form of value every commodity whose value is to be expressed as a useful object of a given quantity, for instance 15 bushels of com, or 100 lb of coffee. A given quantity of any commodity contains a definite quantity of human labor. Therefore, the form of value must not only express value in general, but also quantitatively determine value, the magnitude of value. In the value relation of commodity A to commodity B, of the linen to the coat, therefore, not only is the commodity type coat equated with the linen in qualitative terms as an object of value as such, but also a definite quantity of the object of value or equivalent. One coat, for example, is equated with a definite quantity of linen, such as 20 yards. The equation 2019. In a certain sense, a man is in the same situation as a commodity. As he neither enters into the world in possession of a mirror, nor is a Fichtean philosopher who can say, I am I, a man first sees and recognizes himself in I. Another man. Peter only relates to himself as a man through his relation to another man, Paul, in whom he recognizes his likeness. With this, however, Paul also becomes from head to toe, in his physical form as Paul, the form of appearance of the species man for Peter. Paris is certainly worth a mass. Henry IV's supposed words on his conversion to Roman Catholicism in 1593. The commodity 145 yards of linen equals 1 coat, or 20 yards of linen are worth 1 coat, presupposes the presence in 1 coat of exactly as much of the substance of value as there is in 20 yards of linen, implies therefore that the quantities in which the two commodities are present have cost the same amount of labor or the same quantity of labor time. But the labor time necessary for the production of 20 yards of linen or 1 coat varies with every change in the productivity of the weaver or the tailor. The influence of such changes on the relative expression of the magnitude of value must now be investigated more closely. I let the value of the linen change 20 while the value of the coat remains constant. If the labor time necessary for the production of linen be doubled, as a result of the increasing infertility of flax-growing soil for instance, its value will also be doubled. Instead of the equation 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, we should have 20 yards of linen equals 2 coats, since 1 coat would now contain only half as much labor time as 20 yards of linen. If, on the other hand, the necessary labor time be reduced by 1/2, as a result of improved looms for instance, the value of the linen will fall by 1/2. In accordance with this, the equation will now read 20 yards of linen equals T coat. The relative value of commodity A, i.e. its value expressed in commodity B, rises and falls in direct relation to the value of A, if the value of B remains constant. 2. Let the value of the linen remain constant, while the value of the coat changes. If, under these circumstances, the labor time necessary for the production of a coat is doubled, as a result, for instance, of a poor crop of wool, we should have, instead of 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, 20 yards of linen equals T coat. If, on the other hand, the value of the coat sinks by 1/2, then 20 yards of linen equals 2 coats. Hence, if the value of commodity A remains constant, its relative value, as expressed in commodity B, rises and falls in inverse relation to the change in the value of B. If we compare the different cases examined under headings I and II, it emerges that the same change in the magnitude of relative value may arise from entirely opposed causes. Thus, the equation 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat becomes 20 yards of linen equals 2 coats, either because the value of the linen has doubled or because the value of the coat has fallen by 1/2, and it becomes 20/20. Here, as occasionally also on previous pages, we use the expression value for quantitatively determined values, i.e. for the magnitude of value. 146 commodities and money yards of linen equals coat, either because the value of the linen has fallen by 1/2, or because the value of the coat has doubled. 3. Let the quantities of labor necessary for the production of the linen and the coat vary simultaneously in the same direction in the same proportion. In this case, 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, as before, whatever change may have taken place in their respective values. Their change of value is revealed only when they are compared with a third commodity, whose value has remained constant. If the values of all commodities rose or fell simultaneously, and in the same proportion, their relative values would remain unaltered. The change in their real values would be manifested by an increase or decrease in the quantity of commodities produced within the same labor time. IV. The labor time necessary for the production respectively of the linen and the coat, and hence their values, may vary simultaneously in the same direction, but to an unequal degree, or in opposite directions, and so on. The influence of all possible combinations of this kind on the relative value of a commodity can be worked out simply by applying cases I, II and III. Thus real changes in the magnitude of value are neither unequivocally nor exhaustively reflected in their relative expression, or, in other words, in the magnitude of the relative value. The relative value of a commodity may vary, although its value remains constant. Its relative value may remain constant, although its value varies, and finally, simultaneous variations in the magnitude of its value and in the relative expression of that magnitude do not by any means have to correspond at all points. 21. 21. The WLGAR economists have exploited this lack of congruence between the magnitude of value and its relative expression with their customary ingenuity. For example, once admit that A falls, because B, with which it is exchanged, rises, while no less labor is bestowed in the meantime on A, and your general principle of value falls to the ground. He, Ricardo, allowed that when A rises in value relatively to B, B falls in value relatively to A, he cut away the ground on which he rested his grand proposition, that the value of a commodity is ever determined by the labor embodied in it. For if a change in the cost of A alters not only its own value in relation to B, for which it is exchanged, but also the value of B relatively to that of A, though no change has taken place in the quantity of labor to produce B, then not only the doctrine falls to the ground which asserts that the quantity of labor bestowed on an article regulates its value, but also that which affirms the cost of an article. To Marx explains his use of the term vulgar economists in section 4 of this chapter, pp. 174-5, n. 34. The commodity 147, e. The equivalent form. We have seen that a commodity A, the linen, by expressing its value in the use value of a commodity B of a different kind, the coat, impresses upon the latter a form of value peculiar to it, namely that of the equivalent. The commodity linen brings to view its own existence as a value through the fact that the coat can be equated with the linen although it has not assumed a form of value distinct from its own physical form. The coat is directly exchangeable with the linen. In this way the linen in fact expresses its own existence as a value, worth saying. The equivalent form of a commodity, accordingly, is the form in which it is directly exchangeable with other commodities. If one kind of commodity, such as a coat, serves as the equivalent of another, such as linen, and coats therefore acquire the characteristic property of being in a form in which they can be directly exchanged with linen, this still by no means provides us with the proportion in which the two are exchangeable. Since the magnitude of the value of the linen is a given quantity, this proportion depends on the magnitude of the coat's value. Whether the coat is expressed as the equivalent in the linen as relative value, or, inversely, the linen is expressed as equivalent in the coat as relative value, the magnitude of the coat's value is determined, as ever, by the labor time necessary for its production, independently of its value form. But as soon as the coat takes up the position of the equivalent in the value expression, the magnitude of its value ceases to be expressed quantitatively. On the contrary, the coat now figures in the value equation merely as a definite quantity of some article. For instance, 40 yards of linen are worth what? 2 coats. Because the commodity coat here plays the part of equivalent, because the use value coat counts as the embodiment of value vis-a-vis the linen, a definite number of coats is sufficient to express a definite QL1 onto T of value in the linen. 2 coats can therefore express the magnitude of value of 40 yards of linen, but they can regulate its value. J. Broadhurst, Political Economy, London, 1842, pp. 11 and 14. Mr. Broadhurst might just as well say, consider the fractions 10/20ths, 10/50ths, 10/100ths, etc. The number 10 remains unchanged, and yet its proportional magnitude, its magnitude in relation to the numbers 20, 50, 100 continually diminishes. Therefore, the great principle that the magnitude of a whole number, such as 10, is regulated by the number of times the number 1 is contained in it falls to the ground. 148 commodities in money never express the magnitude of their own value. Because they had a superficial conception of this fact, i.e. because they considered that in the equation of value the equivalent always has the form of a simple quantity of some article, of a use value, Bailey and many of his predecessors and followers were misled into seeing the expression of value as merely a quantitative relation. Whereas in fact the equivalent form of a commodity contains no quantitative determinant of value. The first peculiarity which strikes us when we reflect on the equivalent form is this, that use value becomes the form of appearance of its opposite, value. The natural form of the commodity becomes its value form. But, note well, this substitution only occurs in the case of a commodity B, coat, or maize, or iron, etc., when some other commodity A, linen, etc., enters into a value relation with it, and then only within the limits of this relation. Since a commodity cannot be related to itself as equivalent, and therefore cannot make its own physical shape into the expression of its own value, it must be related to another commodity as equivalent, and therefore must make the physical shape of another commodity into its own value form. Let us make this clear with the example of a measure which is applied to commodities as material objects, as use values. A sugar loaf, because it is a body, is heavy and therefore possesses weight, but we can neither take a look at this weight nor touch it. We then take various pieces of iron, whose weight has been determined beforehand. The bodily form of the iron, considered for itself, is no more the form of appearance of weight than is the sugar loaf. Nevertheless, in order to express the sugar loaf as a weight, we put it into a relation of weight with the iron. In this relation, the iron counts as a body representing nothing but weight. Quantities of iron therefore serve to measure the weight of the sugar, and represent, in relation to the sugar loaf, weight in its pure form, the form of manifestation of weight. This part is played by the iron only within this relation, within the relation into which the sugar, or any other body whose weight is to be found, enters with the iron. If both objects lacked weight, they the most superficial form of exchange value, that is the quantitative relation in which commodities exchange with one another. T. Constitutes. T. According to Bale Yt their value, Karl Marx, Theories of Surplus Value, Part 3, London, 1972, page 129. The commodity 149 could not enter into this relation, hence the one could not serve to express the weight of the other. When we throw both of them into the scales, we see in reality that considered as weight they are the same, and therefore that, taken in the appropriate proportions, they have the same weight. Just as the body of the iron, as a measure of weight, represents weight alone, in relation to the sugar loaf, so, in our expression of value, the body of the coat represents value alone. Here, however, the analogy ceases. In the expression of the weight of the sugar loaf, the iron represents a natural property common to both bodies, their weight, but in the expression of value of the linen the coat represents a supranatural property, their value, which is something purely social. The relative value form of a commodity, the linen for example, expresses its value existence as something wholly different from its substance and properties, as the quality of being comparable with a coat for example. This expression itself therefore indicates that it conceals a social relation. With the equivalent form the reverse is true. The equivalent form consists precisely in this, that the material commodity itself, the coat for instance, expresses value just as it is in its everyday life, and is therefore endowed with the form of value by nature itself. Admittedly, this holds good only within the value relation, in which the commodity linen is related to the commodity coat as its equivalent. 22. However, the properties of a thing do not arise from its relations to other things, they are, on the contrary, merely activated by such relations. The coat, therefore, seems to be endowed with its equivalent form, its property of direct exchangeability, by nature, just as much as its property of being heavy or its ability to keep us warm. Hence the mysteriousness of the equivalent form, which only impinges on the crude bourgeois vision of the political economist when it confronts him in its fully developed shape, that of money. He then seeks to explain away the mystical character of gold and silver by substituting for them less dazzling commodities, and, with ever-renewed satisfaction, reeling off a catalogue of all the 22 determinations of reflection, reflections bestimmungen, of this kind are altogether very curious. For instance, one man is king only because other men stand in the relation of subjects to him. They, on the other hand, imagine that they are subjects because he is king. 3. Crossing. Hegel, Science of Logic, Trail A. V. Miller, London, 1969, pp. 409-11, where the determinations of reflection are stated to be, not of a qualitative kind, but determinatenesses which are themselves relations. 150 commodities and money inferior commodities which have played the role of the equivalent at one time or another. He does not suspect that even the simplest expression of value, such as 20 yards of linen equals one coat, already presents the riddle of the equivalent form for us to solve. The body of the commodity, which serves as the equivalent, always figures as the embodiment of abstract human labor, and is always the product of some specific useful and concrete labor. This concrete labor therefore becomes the expression of abstract human labor. If the coat is merely abstract human labor's realization, the tailoring actually realized in it is merely abstract human labor's form of realization. In the expression of value of the linen, the usefulness of tailoring consists, not in making clothes, and thus also people, but in making a physical object which we at once recognize as value, as a congealed quantity of labor, therefore, which is absolutely indistinguishable from the labor objectified in the value of the linen. In order to act as such a mirror of value, tailoring itself must reflect nothing apart from its own abstract quality of being human labor. Human labor power is expended in the form of tailoring as well as in the form of weaving. Both therefore possess the general property of being human labor, and they therefore have to be considered in certain cases, such as the production of value, solely from this point of view. There is nothing mysterious in this. But in the value expression of the commodity the question is stood on its head. In order to express the fact that, for instance, weaving creates the value of linen through its general property of being human labor rather than in its concrete form as weaving, we contrast it with the concrete labor which produces the equivalent of the linen, namely tailoring. Tailoring is now seen as the tangible form of realization of abstract human labor. The equivalent form therefore possesses a second peculiarity. In it, concrete labor becomes the form of manifestation of its opposite, abstract human labor. But because this concrete labor, tailoring, counts exclusively as the expression of indifferentiated human labor, it possesses the characteristic of being identical with other kinds of labor, such as the labor embodied in the linen. Consequently, although, like all other commodity-producing labor, it is the labor of private individuals, it is nevertheless labor in its directly social form. It is precisely for this reason that it presents itself to us in the shape of a product which is directly exchangeable with other commodities. The commodity 151 thus the equivalent form has a third peculiarity. Private labor takes the form of its opposite, namely labor in its directly social form. The two peculiarities of the equivalent form we have just developed will become still clearer if we go back to the great investigator who was the first to analyze the value form, like so many other forms of thought, society and nature. I mean Aristotle. In the first place, he states quite clearly that the money form of the commodity is only a more developed aspect of the simple form of value, i.e. of the expression of the value of a commodity in some other commodity chosen at random, for he says, 5 beds equals 1 house, Calvert. L7T and V, and Sivtef, OBDRT. Less than winking face is indistinguishable from 5 beds equals a certain amount of money, Ka VRT. L7 Tevet, and Sivtef. OAU RT. L 7 trillion euros V, and Zalvert. L. He further sees that the value relation which provides the framework for this expression of value itself requires that the house should be qualitatively equated with the bed, and that these things, being distinct to the senses, could not be compared with each other as commensurable magnitudes if they lacked this essential identity. There can be no exchange, he says, without equality, and no equality without commensurability. Route, low, oat, 1, less than. OUO, 1, less than. J1J and, to P, RT, less than. Here, however, he falters, and abandons the further analysis of the form of value. It is, however, in reality, impossible RC, EVOI 5 VCIAYJE and pound C8 UVRT. TOV, that such unlike things can be commensurable, qualitatively equal. This form of equation can only be something foreign to the true nature of the things, it is therefore only a makeshift for practical purposes. Aristotle therefore himself tells us what prevented any further analysis, the lack of a concept of value. What is the homogeneous element, i.e. the common substance, which the house represents from the point of view of the bed, in the value expression for the bed? Such a thing, in truth, cannot exist, says Aristotle. But why not? Towards the bed, the house represents something equal, in so far as it represents what is really equal, both in the bed and the house. And that is human labor. However, Aristotle himself was unable to extract this fact, that the quotations in this paragraph are from Aristotle, Nicomachean Ethics BKV, ch. 5. Loeb edition, London, 1926, pp. 287-9. 152 Commodities and money in the form of commodity values. All labor is expressed as equal human labor and therefore as labor of equal quality, by inspection from the form of value, because Greek society was founded on the labor of slaves, hence had as its natural basis the inequality of men and of their labor powers. The secret of the expression of value, namely the equality and equivalence of all kinds of labor because and in so far as they are human labor in general, could not be deciphered until the concept of human equality had already acquired the permanence of a fixed popular opinion. This however becomes possible only in a society where the commodity form is the universal form of the product of labor, hence the dominant social relation is the relation between men as possessors of commodities. Aristotle's genius is displayed precisely by his discovery of a relation of equality in the value expression of commodities. Only the historical limitation inherent in the society in which he lived prevented him from finding out what, in reality, this relation of equality consisted of. IV, the simple, or MO, value considered as a whole. A commodity's simple form of value is contained in its value relation with another commodity of a different kind, i.e. in its exchange relation with the latter. The value of commodity A is qualitatively expressed by the direct exchangeability of commodity B with commodity A. It is quantitatively expressed by the exchangeability of a specific quantity of commodity B with a given quantity of A. In other words, the value of a commodity is independently expressed through its presentation, Darstellung, as exchange value. When, at the beginning of this chapter, we said in the customary manner that a commodity is both a use value and an exchange value, this was, strictly speaking, wrong. A commodity is a use value or object of utility and a value. It appears as the twofold thing it really is as soon as its value possesses its own particular form of manifestation, which is distinct from its natural form. This form of manifestation is exchange value, and the commodity never has this form when looked at in isolation, but only when it is in a value relation or an exchange relation with a second commodity of a different kind. Once we know this, our manner of speaking does no harm, it serves, rather, as an abbreviation. Our analysis has shown that the form of value, that is, the expression of the value of a commodity, arises from the nature of commodity value, as opposed to value and its magnitude arising from their mode of expression as exchange value. This second, the commodity 153 view is the delusion both of the mercantilists, and people like Ferrier, Guény, etc., 23 who have made a modern rehash of mercantilism, and their antipodes, the modem bagmen of free trade, such as Bastiat and his associates. The mercantilists place their main emphasis on the qualitative side of the expression of value, hence on the equivalent form of the commodity, which in its finished form is money. The modern peddlers of free trade, on the other hand, who must get rid of their commodities at any price, stress the quantitative side of the relative form of value. For them, accordingly, there exists neither value, nor magnitude of value, anywhere except in its expression by means of the exchange relation, that is, in the daily list of prices current on the stock exchange. The Scotsman MacLeod, whose function it is to trick out the confused ideas of Lombard Street in the most learned finery, is a successful cross between the superstitious mercantilists and the enlightened peddlers of free trade. A close scrutiny of the expression of the value of commodity A contained in the value relation of A to B has shown that within that relation the natural form of commodity A figures only as the aspect of use value, while the natural form of B figures only as the form of value, or aspect of value. The internal opposition between use value and value, hidden within the commodity, is therefore represented on the surface by an external opposition, i.e. by a relation between two commodities such that the one commodity, whose own value is supposed to be expressed, counts directly only as a use value, whereas the other commodity, in which that value is to be expressed, counts directly only as exchange value. Hence the simple form of value of a commodity is the simple form of appearance of the opposition between use value and value which is contained within the commodity. The product of labor is an object of utility in all states of society, but it is only a historically specific epoch of development which presents the labor expended in the production of a useful 23. F. L. A. Perrier, sous inspecteur des douanes, du gouvernement consider dans ses rapports avec e-commerce, Paris, 1805, and Charles Gonnial, Des systèmes d'économie politique, 2nd eden, Paris, 1821. H. D. MacLeod, 1821-1902, opponent of the classical economists, who, Marx says, misinterprets the most elementary economic relations to such an extent that he asserts that money in general arises from its most advanced form, that is means of payment. Karl Marx, A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, page 143. 154 Commodities and money article is an objective property of that article, i.e. is its value. It is only then that the product of labor becomes transformed into a commodity. It therefore follows that the simple form of value of the commodity is at the same time the simple form of value of the product of labor, and also that the development of the commodity form coincides with the development of the value form. We perceive straightaway the insufficiency of the simple form of value. It is an embryonic form which must undergo a series of metamorphoses before it can ripen into the price form. The expression of the value of commodity A in terms of any other commodity B merely distinguishes the value of A from its use value, and therefore merely places A in an exchange relation with any particular single different kind of commodity, instead of representing A's qualitative equality with all other commodities and its quantitative proportionality to them. To the simple relative form of value of a commodity there corresponds the single equivalent form of another commodity. Thus, in the relative expression of value of the linen, the coat only possesses the form of equivalent, the form of direct exchangeability, in relation to this one individual commodity, the linen. Nevertheless, the simple form of value automatically passes over into a more complete form. Admittedly, this simple form only expresses the value of a commodity A in one commodity of another kind. But what this second commodity is, whether it is a coat, iron, corn, etc., is a matter of complete indifference. Therefore different simple expressions of the value of one and the same commodity arise according to whether that commodity enters into a value relation with this second commodity or another kind of commodity. 24 The number of such possible expressions is limited only by the number of the different kinds of commodities distinct from it. The isolated expression of A's value is thus transformed into the indefinitely expandable series of different simple expressions of that value. B. The total or expanded form of value Z commodity A equals U commodity B or equals V commodity C or equals W commodity D or equals X commodity E or equals etc. 24. In Homer, for instance, Iliad, 7, 472-5, the value of a thing is expressed in a series of different things. The commodity 155, 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat or equals 10 lb tea or equals 40 lb coffee or equals 1 quarter of corn or equals 2 ounces of gold or equals ton of iron or equals etc. 1. The expanded relative form of value, the value of a commodity, the linen for example, is now expressed in terms of innumerable other members of the world of commodities. Every other physical commodity now becomes a mirror of the linen's value. 2. It is thus that this value first shows itself as being, in reality, a congealed quantity of undifferentiated human labor. For the labor which creates it is now explicitly presented as labor which counts as the equal of every other sort of human labor, whatever natural form it may possess, hence whether it is objectified in a coat, in corn, in iron, or in gold. The linen, by virtue of the form of value, no longer stands in a social relation with merely one other kind of commodity, but with the whole world of commodities as well. As a commodity it is a citizen of that world. At the same time, the endless series of expressions of its value implies that, from the point of view of the value of the commodity, the particular form of use value in which it appears is a matter of indifference. In the first form, 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, it might well be a purely accidental occurrence that these two commodities are X25. For this reason we can speak of the coat value of the linen when its value is expressed in coats, or of its corn value when expressed in corn, and so on. Every such expression tells us that it is the value of the linen which appears in the use values coat, etc. The value of any commodity denoting its relation in exchange, we may speak of it as corn value, cloth value, according to the commodity with which it is compared. And hence there are 1,000 different kinds of value, as many kinds of value as there are commodities in existence, and all are equally real and equally nominal. A critical dissertation on the nature, measure, and causes of value, chiefly in reference to the writings of Mr. Ricardo and his followers. By the author of Essays on the Formation, etc. O. Opinions, London, 1825, page 39, S. Bailey. The author of this anonymous work, which in its day created a considerable stir in England, was under the delusion that by pointing to the multiplicity of the relative express signs of the same commodity value he had obliterated any possibility of a conceptual determination of value. Still, despite the narrowness of his own outlook he was able to put his finger on some serious defects in the Ricardian theory, as is demonstrated by the animosity with which he was attacked by Ricardo's followers, in the Westminster Review for example. The Westminster Review was FOWLDED in 1824 by Bentham and Bowring, as a quarterly journal of orthodox radicalism. It was Ricardian in economic theory. 1s6 commodities and money changeable in a specific quantitative relation. In the second form, on the contrary, the background to this accidental appearance, essentially different from it, and determining it, immediately shines through. The value of the linen remains unaltered in magnitude, whether expressed in coats, coffee, or iron, or in innumerable different commodities, belonging to as many different owners. The accidental relation between two individual commodity owners disappears. It becomes plain that it is not the exchange of commodities which regulates the magnitude of their values, but rather the reverse, the magnitude of the value of commodities which regulates the proportion in which they exchange. 2. The particular equivalent form each commodity, such as coat, tea, iron, etc., figures in the expression of value of the linen as an equivalent, hence as a physical object possessing value. The specific natural form of each of these commodities is now a particular equivalent form alongside many others. In the same way, the many specific, concrete, and useful kinds of labor contained in the physical commodities now count as the same number of particular forms of realization or manifestation of human labor in general. 3. De ECTSO. The total or expanded, or MO, value. Firstly, the relative expression of value of the commodity is incomplete, because the series of its representations never comes to an end. The chain, of which each equation of value is a link, is liable at any moment to be lengthened by a newly created commodity, which will provide the material for a fresh expression of value. Secondly, it is a motley mosaic of disparate and unconnected expressions of value. And lastly, if, as must be the case, the relative value of each commodity is expressed in this expanded form, it follows that the relative form of value of each commodity is an endless series of expressions of value which are all different from the relative form of value of every other commodity. The defects of the expanded relative form of value are reflected in the corresponding equivalent form. Since the natural form of each particular kind of commodity is one particular equivalent form amongst innumerable other equivalent forms, the only equivalent forms which exist are limited ones, and each of them excludes all. The commodity 157 the others. Similarly, the specific, concrete, useful kind of labor contained in each particular commodity equivalent is only a particular kind of labor and therefore not an exhaustive form of appearance of human labor in general. It is true that the completed or total form of appearance of human labor is constituted by the totality of its particular forms of appearance. But in that case it has no single, unified form of appearance. The expanded relative form of value is, however, nothing but the sum of the simple relative expressions or equations of the first form, such as 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, 20 yards of linen equals 10 lb of tea, etc. However, each of these equations implies the identical equation in reverse. 1 coat equals 20 yards of linen, 10 lb of tea equals 20 yards of linen, etc. In fact, when a person exchanges his linen for many other commodities, and thus expresses its value in a series of other commodities, it necessarily follows that the other owners of commodities exchange them for the linen, and therefore express the values of their various commodities in one and the same third commodity, the linen. If, then, we reverse the series 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, or equals 10 lb of tea, etc., i.e. if we give expression to the converse relation already implied in the series, we get C. The general form of value 1 coat 10 lb of tea 40 lb of coffee 1/4 of com equals 20 yards of linen 2 ounces of gold t ton of iron x commodity A, etc. 1. The changed character of the form of value the commodities now present their values to us, 1. In a simple form, because in a single commodity. 2. In a unified form, because in the same commodity each time. Their form of value is simple and common to all, hence general. 158 commodities and money. The two previous forms, let us call them A and B, only amounted to the expression of the value of a commodity as something distinct from its own use value or its physical shape as a commodity. The first form, A, produced equations like this: 1 coat equals 20 yards of linen, 10 lb of tea equals 1 ton of iron. The value of the coat is expressed as comparable with linen. Asterisk that of the tea is comparable with iron. But to be comparable with linen and with iron, these expressions of the value of coat and tea is to be as different as linen is from iron. This form, it is plain, appears in practice only in the early stages, when the products of labor are converted into commodities by accidental occasional exchanges. The second form, B, distinguishes the value of a commodity from its own use value more adequately than the first. T for the value of the coat now stands in contrast with its natural form in all possible shapes, in the sense that it is equated with linen, iron, tea, in short with everything but itself. On the other hand, any expression of value common to all commodities is directly excluded. For, in the expression of value of each commodity, all other commodities now appear only in the form of equivalence. The expanded form of value comes into actual existence for the first time when a particular product of labor, such as cattle, is no longer exceptionally, but habitually, exchanged for various other commodities. The new form we have just obtained expresses the values of the world of commodities through one single kind of commodity set apart from the rest, through the linen for example, and thus represents the values of all commodities by means of their equality with linen. Through its equation with linen, the value of every commodity is now not only differentiated from its own use value, but from all use values, and is, by that very fact, expressed as that which is common to all commodities. By this form, commodities are, for the first time, really brought into relation with each other as values, or permitted to appear to each other as exchange values. The two earlier forms express the value of each commodity either in terms of a single commodity of a different kind, or in a series of many commodities which differ from the first one. In both cases it is the private task, so to speak, of the individual. Comparable with linen is the expression we have chosen to render Leinwandgleiches. Comparable with iron renders Eisengleiches, and so od. These circumlocutions are unavoidable here. The commodity 159 commodity to give itself a form of value, and it accomplishes this task without the aid of the others, which play towards it the merely passive role of equivalent. The general form of value, on the other hand, can only arise as the joint contribution of the whole world of commodities. A commodity only acquires a general expression of its value if, at the same time, all other commodities express their values in the same equivalent, and every newly emergent commodity must follow suit. It thus becomes evident that because the objectivity of commodities as values is the purely social existence of these things, it can only be expressed through the whole range of their social relations. Consequently, the form of their value must possess social validity. In this form, when they are all counted as comparable with the linen, all commodities appear not only as qualitatively equal, as values in general, but also as values of quantitatively comparable magnitude. Because the magnitudes of their values are expressed in one and the same material, the linen, these magnitudes are now reflected in each other. For instance, 10 lb of tea equals 20 yards of linen, and 40 lb of coffee equals 20 yards of linen. Therefore 10 lb of tea equals 40 lb of coffee. In other words, lib. of coffee contains only a quarter as much of the substance of value, that is, labor, as 1 lb of tea. The general relative form of value imposes the character of universal equivalent on the linen, which is the commodity excluded, as equivalent, from the whole world of commodities. Its own natural form is the form assumed in common by the values of all commodities. It is therefore directly exchangeable with all other commodities. The physical form of the linen counts as the visible incarnation, the social chrysalis state, of all human labor. Weaving, the private labor which produces linen, acquires as a result a general social form, the form of equality with all other kinds of labor. The innumerable equations of which the general form of value is composed equate the labor realized in the linen with the labor contained in every other commodity in turn, and they thus convert weaving into the general form of appearance of indifferentiated human labor. In this manner the labor objectified in the values of commodities is not just presented negatively, as labor in which abstraction is made from all the concrete forms and useful properties of actual work. Its own positive nature is explicitly brought out, namely the fact that it is the reduction of all kinds of actual labor to their common character 160 commodities and money of being human labor in general, of being the expenditure of human labor power. The general value form, in which all the products of labor are presented as mere congealed quantities of indifferentiated human labor, shows by its very structure that it is the social expression of the world of commodities. In this way it is made plain that within this world the general human character of labor forms its specific social character. 2. The development of the relative and equivalent forms of value, their interdependence, the degree of development of the relative form of value, and that of the equivalent form, correspond. But we must bear in mind that the development of the equivalent form is only the expression and the result of the development of the relative form. The simple or isolated relative form of value of one commodity converts some other commodity into an isolated equivalent. The expanded form of relative value, that expression of the value of one commodity in terms of all other commodities, imprints those other commodities with the form of particular equivalents of different kinds. Finally, a particular kind of commodity acquires the form of universal equivalent, because all other commodities make it the material embodiment of their uniform and universal form of value. But the antagonism between the relative form of value and the equivalent form, the two poles of the value form, also develops concomitantly with the development of the value form itself. The first form, 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, already contains this antagonism, without as yet fixing it. According to whether we read the same equation forwards or backwards, each of the two commodity poles, such as the linen and the coat, is to be found in the relative form on one occasion, and in the equivalent form on the other occasion. Here it is still difficult to keep hold of the polar antagonism. In form B, only one commodity at a time can completely expand its relative value, and it only possesses this expanded relative form of value because, and in so far as, all other commodities are, with respect to it, equivalents. Here we can no longer reverse the equation 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat without altering its whole character, and converting it from the expanded form into the general form of value. The commodity 161 finally, the last form, C, gives to the world of commodities a general social relative form of value, because, and in so far as, all commodities except one are thereby excluded from the equivalent form. A single commodity, the linen, therefore has the form of direct exchangeability with all other commodities, in other words it has a directly social form because, and in so far as, no other commodity is in this situation. 26 The commodity that figures as universal equivalent is on the other hand excluded from the uniform and therefore universal relative form of value. If the linen, or any other commodity serving as universal equivalent, were, at the same time, to share in the relative form of value, it would have to serve as its own equivalent. We should then have 20 yards of linen equals 20 yards of linen, a tautology in which neither the value nor its magnitude is expressed. In order to express the relative value of the universal equivalent, we must rather reverse the form C. This equivalent has no relative form of value in common with other commodities. Its value is, rather, expressed relatively in the infinite series of all other physical commodities. Thus, the expanded relative form of value, or form B, now appears as the specific relative form of value of the equivalent commodity. 26. It is by no means self-evident that the form of direct and universal exchangeability is an antagonistic form, as inseparable from its opposite, the form of non-direct exchangeability, as the positivity of one pole of a magnet is from the negativity of the other pole. This has allowed the illusion to arise that all commodities can simultaneously be imprinted with the stamp of direct exchangeability, in the same way that it might be imagined that all Catholics can be popes. It is, of course, highly desirable in the eyes of the petty bourgeois, who views the production of commodities as the absolute summit of human freedom and individual independence, that the inconveniences resulting from the impossibility of exchanging commodities directly, which are inherent in this fond, should be removed. This Philistine utopia is depicted in the socialism of Proudhon, which, as I have shown elsewhere, does not even possess the merit of originality, but was in fact developed far more successfully long before Proudhon by Gray, Bray and others. Even so, wisdom of this kind is still rife in certain circles under the name of science. No school of thought has thrown around the word science more haphazardly than that of Proudhon, for wo begriffefehlen, das stellt zur rechten Zeit ein Wort sich ein. T. In Chapter 1 of Marx's 1847 polemic against Proudhon, The Poverty of Philosophy. T. Where thoughts are absent, words are brought in as convenient replacements. A slightly altered quotation from Goethe, Faust, Part 1, Scene 4, Faust Study, lines 1995-6. 162 Commodities and Money. 3. The transition from the general form of value to the money form. The universal equivalent form is a form of value in general. It can therefore be assumed by any commodity. On the other hand, a commodity is only to be found in the universal equivalent form, form C, if, and in so far as, it is excluded from the ranks of all other commodities, as being their equivalent. Only when this exclusion becomes finally restricted to a specific kind of commodity does the uniform relative form of value of the world of commodities attain objective fixedness and general social validity. The specific kind of commodity with whose natural form the equivalent form is socially interwoven now becomes the money commodity, or serves as money. It becomes its specific social function, and consequently its social monopoly, to play the part of universal equivalent within the world of commodities. Among the commodities which in Form B figure as particular equivalents of the linen, and in Form C express in common their relative values in linen, there is one in particular which has historically conquered this advantageous position, gold. If, then, in Form C, we replace the linen by gold, we get D. The money form 20 yards of linen 1 coat 10 lb of tea 40 lb of coffee. Equals 2 ounces of gold 1 quarter of corn. Ton of iron X commodity. If fundamental changes have taken place in the course of the transition from Form A to Form B, and from Form B to Form C as against this, Form D differs not at all from Form C, except that now instead of linen gold has assumed the universal equivalent form. Gold is in Form D what linen was in Form C, the universal equivalent. The advance consists only in that the form of direct and universal exchangeability, in other words the universal equivalent form, has now by social custom finally become entwined with the specific natural form of the commodity gold. Gold confronts the other commodities as money only because it previously confronted them as a commodity. Like all other the commodity 163 commodities, it also functioned as an equivalent, either as a single equivalent in isolated exchanges or as a particular equivalent alongside other commodity equivalents. Gradually it began to serve as universal equivalent in narrower or wider fields. As soon as it had won a monopoly of this position in the expression of value for the world of commodities, it became the money commodity, and only then, when it had already become the money commodity, did Form D become distinct from Form C, and the general form of value come to be transformed into the money form. The simple expression of the relative value of a single commodity, such as linen, in a commodity which is already functioning as the money commodity, such as gold, is the price form. The price form of the linen is therefore 20 yards of linen equals 2 ounces of gold, or, if 2 ounces of gold when coined are 2 pounds, 20 yards of linen equals 2 pounds. The only difficulty in the concept of the money form is that of grasping the universal equivalent form, and hence the general form of value as such. Form C can be reduced by working backwards to Form B, the expanded form of value, and its constitutive element is Form A. 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat or X commodity A equals Y commodity B. The simple commodity form is therefore the germ of the money form. 4. The fetishism of the commodity and its secret a commodity appears at first sight an extremely obvious, trivial thing. But its analysis brings out that it is a very strange thing, abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. So far as it is a use value, there is nothing mysterious about it, whether we consider it from the point of view that by its properties it satisfies human needs, or that it first takes on these properties as the product of human labor. It is absolutely clear that, by his activity, man changes the forms of the materials of nature in such a way as to make them useful to him. The form of wood, for instance, is altered if a table is made out of it. Nevertheless, the table continues to be wood, an ordinary, sensuous thing. But as soon as it emerges as a commodity, it changes into a thing which transcends sensuousness. It not only stands with its feet on the ground, but, in relation to all other commodities, it stands on its head, and evolves out of its wooden brain grotesque ideas, 164 commodities and money far more wonderful than if it were to begin dancing of its own free will. 27. The mystical character of the commodity does not therefore arise from its use value. Just as little does it proceed from the nature of the determinants of value. For in the first place, however varied the useful kinds of labor or productive activities, it is a physiological fact that they are functions of the human organism, and that each such function, whatever may be its nature or its form, is essentially the expenditure of human brain, nerves, muscles and sense organs. Secondly, with regard to the foundation of the quantitative determination of value, namely the duration of that expenditure or the quantity of labor, this is quite palpably different from its quality. In all situations, the labor time it costs to produce the means of subsistence must necessarily concern mankind, although not to the same degree at different stages of development. 28. And finally, as soon as men start to work for each other in any way, their labor also assumes a social form. Whence, then, arises the enigmatic character of the product of one abhor, as soon as it assumes the form of a commodity. Clearly, it arises from this form itself. The equality of the kinds of human labor takes on a physical form in the equal objectivity of the products of labor as values. The measure of the expenditure of human labor power by its duration takes on the form of the magnitude of the value of the products of labor. And finally, the relationships between the producers, within which the social characteristics of their labors are manifested, take on the form of a social relation between the products of labor. The mysterious character of the commodity form consists therefore simply in the fact that the commodity reflects the social characteristics of men's own labor as objective characteristics of 27. One may recall that China and the tables began to dance when the rest of the world appeared to be standing still. Pour encourager les autres, 28. Among the ancient Germans the size of a piece of land was measured according to the labor of a day, hence the acre was called tagwerk, tag wan or nail, or terra journalis, or diornalis, manwork, manskraft, mansmood, manshout, etc. See Georg Ludwig von Maurer, Einleitung zur Geschichte der Mark, Hof, USW. Verfassung, Munich, 1854, page 129 if. To encourage. The others. A reference to the simultaneous emergence in the 18,508 of the Taiping Revolt in China and the craze for spiritualism which swept over upper-class German society. The rest of the world was standing still in the period of reaction immediately after the defeat of the 1848 revolutions. The commodity 165 the products of labor themselves, as the socio-natural properties of these things. Hence it also reflects the social relation of the producers to the sum total of labor as a social relation between objects, a relation which exists apart from and outside the producers. Through this substitution, the products of labor become commodities, sensuous things which are at the same time supra-sensible or social. In the same way, the impression made by a thing on the optic nerve is perceived not as a subjective excitation of that nerve but as the objective form of a thing outside the eye. In the act of seeing, of course, light is really transmitted from one thing, the external object, to another thing, the eye. It is a physical relation between physical things. As against this, the commodity form, and the value relation of the products of labor within which it appears, have absolutely no connection with the physical nature of the commodity and the material, Dinglich, relations arising out of this. It is nothing but the definite social relation between men themselves which assumes here, for them, the fantastic form of a relation between things. In order, therefore, to find an analogy we must take flight into the misty realm of religion. There the products of the human brain appear as autonomous figures endowed with a life of their own, which enter into relations both with each other and with the human race. So it is in the world of commodities with the products of men's hands. I call this the fetishism which attaches itself to the products of labor as soon as they are produced as commodities, and is therefore inseparable from the production of commodities. As the foregoing analysis has already demonstrated, this fetishism of the world of commodities arises from the peculiar social character of the labor which produces them. Objects of utility become commodities only because they are the products of the labor of private individuals who work independently of each other. The sum total of the labor of all these private individuals forms the aggregate labor of society. Since the producers do not come into social contact until they exchange the products of their labor, the specific social characteristics of their private labors appear only within this exchange. In other words, the labor of the private individual manifests itself as an element of the total labor of society only through the relations which the act of exchange establishes between the products, and, through their mediation, between the producers. To 166 commodities and money the producers, therefore, the social relations between their private labors appear as what they are, i.e. they do not appear as direct social relations between persons in their work, but rather as material, Dinglich, relations between persons and social relations between things. It is only by being exchanged that the products of labor acquire a socially uniform objectivity as values, which is distinct from their sensuously varied objectivity as articles of utility. This division of the product of labor into a useful thing and a thing possessing value appears in practice only when exchange has already acquired a sufficient extension and importance to allow useful things to be produced for the purpose of being exchanged, so that their character as values has already to be taken into consideration during production. From this moment on, the labor of the individual producer acquires a twofold social character. On the one hand, it must, as a definite useful kind of labor, satisfy a definite social need, and thus maintain its position as an element of the total labor, as a branch of the social division of labor, which originally sprang up spontaneously. On the other hand, it can satisfy the manifold needs of the individual producer himself only insofar as every particular kind of useful private labor can be exchanged with, i.e. counts as the equal of, every other kind of useful private labor. Equality in the full sense between different kinds of labor can be arrived at only if we abstract from their real inequality, if we reduce them to the characteristic they have in common, that of being the expenditure of human labor power, of human labor in the abstract. The private producer's brain reflects this twofold social character of his labor only in the forms which appear in practical intercourse, in the exchange of products. Hence the socially useful character of his private labor is reflected in the form that the product of labor has to be useful to others, and the social character of the equality of the various kinds of labor is reflected in the form of the common character, as values, possessed by these materially different things, the products of labor. Men do not therefore bring the products of their labor into relation with each other as values because they see these objects merely as the material integuments of homogeneous human labor. The reverse is true. By equating their different products to each other in exchange as values, they equate their different kinds of labor as human labor. They do this without being. The commodity 167 aware of it. 29 value, therefore, does not have its description branded on its forehead, it rather transforms every product of labor into a social hieroglyphic. Later on, men try to decipher the hieroglyphic, to get behind the secret of their own social product, for the characteristic which objects of utility have of being values is as much men's social product as is their language. The belated scientific discovery that the products of labor, insofar as they are values, are merely the material expressions of the human labor expended to produce them, marks an epoch in the history of mankind's development, but by no means banishes the semblance of objectivity possessed by the social characteristics of labor. Something which is only valid for this particular form of production, the production of commodities, namely the fact that the specific social character of private labors carried on independently of each other consists in their equality as human labor, and, in the product, assumes the form of the existence of value, appears to those caught up in the relations of commodity production, and this is true both before and after the above-mentioned scientific discovery, to be just as ultimately valid as the fact that the scientific dissection of the air into its component parts left the atmosphere itself unaltered in its physical configuration. What initially concerns producers in practice when they make an exchange is how much of some other product they get for their own. In what proportions can the products be exchanged? As soon as these proportions have attained a certain customary stability, they appear to result from the nature of the products, so that, for instance, 1 ton of iron and 2 ounces of gold appear to be equal in value, in the same way as a pound of gold and a pound of iron are equal in weight, despite their different physical and chemical properties. The value character of the products of labor becomes firmly established only when they act as magnitudes of value. These magnitudes vary continually, independently of the will, foreknowledge and actions of the exchangers. Their own movement within society has for them the form of a movement made by things, and these things, far from being under 29. Therefore, when Galiani said, value is a relation between persons, la ricchezza è una ragione tra due persone, he ought to have added, a relation concealed beneath a material shell. Galiani, Della Moneta, page 221, volume 3. Of Custodi's collection entitled Scritter, Classic, Italiani di Economia Politica, Parte Moderna, Milan, 1803. 168 commodities and money their control, in fact control them. The production of commodities must be fully developed before the scientific conviction emerges, from experience itself, that all the different kinds of private labor, which are carried on independently of each other, and yet, as spontaneously developed branches of the social division of labor, are in a situation of all-round dependence on each other, are continually being reduced to the quantitative proportions in which society requires them. The reason for this reduction is that in the midst of the accidental and ever-fluctuating exchange relations between the products, the labor time socially necessary to produce them asserts itself as a regulative law of nature. In the same way, the law of gravity asserts itself when a person's house collapses on top of him. 30. The determination of the magnitude of value by labor time is therefore a secret hidden under the apparent movements in the relative values of commodities. Its discovery destroys the semblance of the merely accidental determination of the magnitude of the value of the products of labor, but by no means abolishes that determination's material form. Reflection on the forms of human life, hence also scientific analysis of those forms, takes a course directly opposite to their real development. Reflection begins post festum, and therefore with the results of the process of development ready to hand. The forms which stamp products as commodities and which are therefore the preliminary requirements for the circulation of commodities, already possess the fixed quality of natural forms of social life before man seeks to give an account, not of their historical character, for in his eyes they are immutable, but of their content and meaning. Consequently, it was solely the analysis of the prices of commodities which led to the determination of the magnitude of value, and solely the common expression of all commodities in money which led to the establishment of their character as values. It is however precisely this finished form of the world of commodities, the money form, which conceals the social character of private labor in the social relations between the individual 30. What are we to think of a law which can only assert itself through periodic crises? It is just a natural law which depends on the lack of awareness of the people who undergo it. Friedrich Engels, Umris Zui, Ner Kerr, Tick der Nat, Ona, Ökonomie, in the Deutsch Französische Jahrbucher, edited by Arnold Ruge and Karl Marx, Paris, 1844. English translation in Marx, Ng. S. Collected Works, Volume 3, London, 1975, po. 433. After the feast, i.e. after the events reflected on have taken place. The commodity 169 workers, by making those relations appear as relations between material objects, instead of revealing them plainly. If I state that coats or boots stand in a relation to linen because the latter is the universal incarnation of abstract human labor, the absurdity of the statement is self-evident. Nevertheless, when the producers of coats and boots bring these commodities into a relation with linen, or with gold or silver, and this makes no difference here, as the universal equivalent, the relation between their own private labor and the collective labor of society appears to them in exactly this absurd form. The categories of bourgeois economics consist precisely of forms of this kind. They are forms of thought which are socially valid, and therefore objective, for the relations of production belonging to this historically determined mode of social production, i.e. commodity production. The whole mystery of commodities, all the magic and necromancy that surrounds the products of labor on the basis of commodity production, vanishes therefore as soon as we come to other forms of production. As political economists are fond of Robinson Crusoe stories, 31 let us first look at Robinson on his island. Undemanding though he is by nature, he still has needs to satisfy, and must therefore perform useful labors of various kinds. He must make tools, knock together furniture, tame llamas, fish, hunt and so on. Of his prayers and the like, we take no account here, since our friend takes pleasure in them and sees them as recreation. Despite the diversity of his productive functions, he knows that they are only different forms of activity of one and the same Robinson, hence only different modes of human labor. Necessity itself compels him to divide his time with precision between his different func. 31. Even Ricardo has his Robinson Crusoe stories. Ricardo makes his primitive fisherman and primitive hunter into owners of commodities who immediately exchange their fish and game in proportion to the labor time which is materialized in these exchange values. On this occasion he slips into the anachronism of allowing the primitive fisherman and hunter to calculate the value of their implements in accordance with the annuity tables used on the London Stock Exchange in 1817. Apart from bourgeois society, the parallelograms of Mr. Owen seem to have been the only form of society Ricardo was acquainted with. Karl Marx, Zur Kerr, Tick etc., pp. 38-9, English translation, page 60. The parallelograms were the utopian socialist Robert Owen's suggestion for the most appropriate layout for a workers' STT Lement, made in A New View of Society, 1813, and immediately seized on by his critics. Ricardo's reference to them is from his On Protection of Agriculture, London, 1822, page 21. 170 commodities and money tions. Whether one function occupies a greater space in his total activity than another depends on the magnitude of the difficulties to be overcome in attaining the useful effect aimed at. Our friend Robinson Crusoe learns this by experience, and having saved a watch, ledger, ink and pen from the shipwreck, he soon begins, like a good Englishman, to keep a set of books. His stock book contains a catalogue of the useful objects he possesses, of the various operations necessary for their production, and finally of the labor time that specific quantities of these products have on average cost him. All the relations between Robinson and these objects that form his self-created wealth are here so simple and transparent that even Mr. Sedley Taylor could understand them. And yet though relations contain all the essential determinants of value, let us now transport ourselves from Robinson's island, bathed in light, to medieval Europe, shrouded in darkness. Here, instead of the independent man, we find everyone dependent, serfs and lords, vassals and suzerains, laymen and clerics. Personal dependence characterizes the social relations of material production as much as it does the other spheres of life based on that production. But precisely because relations of personal dependence form the given social foundation, there is no need for labor and its products to assume a fantastic form different from their reality. They take the shape, in the transactions of society, of services in kind and payments in kind. The natural form of labor, its particular ity, and not, as in a society based on commodity production, its universality, is here its immediate social form. The corvée can be measured by time just as well as the labor which produces commodities, but every serf knows that what he expends in the service of his lord is a specific quantity of his own personal labor power. The tithe owed to the priest is more clearly apparent than his blessing. Whatever we may think, then, of the different roles in which men confront each other in such a society, the social relations between individuals in the performance of their labor appear at all events as their own personal relations, and are not disguised as social relations between things, between the products of labor. The original German has here, Herr M. Wirth, chosen by Marx as a run-of-the-mill vulgar economist and propagandist familiar to German readers. Engels introduced Mr. Sedley Taylor, a Cambridge don against whom he polemicized in his preface to the fourth German edition, see above, page 117. The commodity 171 for an example of labor in common, i.e. directly associated labor, we do not need to go back to the spontaneously developed form which we find at the threshold of the history of all civilized peoples. 32 We have one nearer to hand in the patriarchal rural industry of a peasant family which produces corn, cattle, yarn, linen and clothing for its own use. These things confront the family as so many products of its collective labor, but they do not confront each other as commodities. The different kinds of labor which create these products, such as tilling the fields, tending the cattle, spinning, weaving and making clothes, are already in their natural form social functions, for they are functions of the family, which, just as much as a society based on commodity production, possesses its own spontaneously developed division of labor. The distribution of labor within the family and the labor time expended by the individual members of the family are regulated by differences of sex and age as well as by seasonal variations in the natural conditions of labor. The fact that the expenditure of the individual labor powers is measured by duration appears here, by its very nature, as a social characteristic of labor itself, because the individual labor powers, by their very nature, act only as instruments of the joint labor power of the family. Let us finally imagine, for a change, an association of free men, working with the means of production held in common, and expending their many different forms of labor power in full self-awareness as one single social labor force. All the characteristics of Robinson's labor are repeated here, but with the difference that they are social instead of individual. All Robinson's products were exclusively the result of his own personal labor and they were therefore directly objects of utility for him personally. The total product of our imagined association is a social product. One part of this product serves as fresh means of production in Re 32. A ridiculous notion has spread abroad recently that communal property in its natural, spontaneous form is specifically Slav, indeed exclusively Russian. In fact, it is the primitive form that we can prove to have existed among Romans, Teutons and Celts, and which indeed still exists to this day in India, in a whole range of diverse patterns, albeit sometimes only as remnants. A more exact study of the Asiatic, and specifically of the Indian form of communal property would indicate the way in which different forms of spontaneous, primitive communal property give rise to different forms of its dissolution. Thus the different original types of Roman and Germanic private property can be deduced from the different forms of Indian communal property. Karl Marx, Zur Kritik, etc. Page 10, English translation, page 33. 172 Commodities and money means social. But another part is consumed by the members of the association as means of subsistence. This part must therefore be divided amongst them. The way this division is made will vary with the particular kind of social organization of production and the corresponding level of social development attained by the producers. We shall assume, but only for the sake of a parallel with the production of commodities, that the share of each individual producer in the means of subsistence is determined by his labor time. Labor time would in that case ply a double part. Its apportionment in accordance with a definite social plan maintains the correct proportion between the different functions of labor and the various needs of the associations. On the other hand, labor time also serves as a measure of the part taken by each individual in the common labor, and of his share in the part of the total product destined for individual consumption. The social relations of the individual producers, both towards their labor and the products of their labor, are here transparent in their simplicity, in production as well as in distribution. For a society of commodity producers, whose general social relation of production consists in the fact that they treat their products as commodities, hence as values, and in this material, Sachlik, form bring their individual, private labors into relation with each other as homogeneous human labor, Christianity with its religious cult of man in the abstract, more particularly in its bourgeois development, i.e. in Protestantism, deism, etc., is the most fitting form of religion. In the ancient Asiatic, classical antique, and other such modes of production, the transformation of the product into a commodity, and therefore men's existence as producers of commodities, plays a subordinate role, which however increases in importance as these communities approach nearer and nearer to the stage of their dissolution. Trading nations, properly so called, exist only in the interstices of the ancient world, like the gods of Epicurus in the Intermundia, or Jews in the pores of Polish society. Those ancient social organisms of production are much more simple and transparent than those of bourgeois society. According to the Greek philosopher Epicurus, circa 341 circa 270 BC, the gods existed only in the intermund, or spaces between different worlds, and had no influence on the course of human affairs. Very few of the writings of Epicurus have been preserved in the original Greek, and this particular idea survived only by being included in Cicero, De Natura Deorum, Book 1, Section 18. The commodity 173 but they are founded either on the immaturity of man as an individual, when he has not yet torn himself loose from the umbilical cord of his natural species connection with other men, or on direct relations of dominance and servitude. They are conditioned by a low stage of development of the productive powers of labor and correspondingly limited relations between men within the process of creating and reproducing their material life, hence also limited relations between man and nature. These real limitations are reflected in the ancient worship of nature and in other elements of tribal religions. The religious reflections of the real world can, in any case, vanish only when the practical relations of everyday life between man and nature, generally present themselves to him in a transparent and rational form. The veil is not removed from the countenance of the social life process, i.e. the process of material production, until it becomes production by freely associated men, and stands under their conscious and planned control. This, however, requires that society possess a material foundation, or a series of material conditions of existence, which in their turn are the natural and spontaneous product of a long and tormented historical development. Political Economy has indeed analyzed value and its magnitude, however incompletely, 33, and has uncovered the content concealed, 33. The insufficiency of Ricardo's analysis of the magnitude of value, and his analysis is by far the best, will appear from the third and fourth books of this work. As regards value in general, classical political economy in fact nowhere distinguishes explicitly and with a clear awareness between labor as it appears in the value of a product, and the same labor as it appears in the product's use value. Of course the distinction is made in practice, since labor is treated sometimes from its quantitative aspect, and at other times qualitatively. But it does not occur to the economists that a purely quantitative distinction between the kinds of labor presupposes their qualitative unity or equality, and therefore their reduction to abstract human labor. For instance, Ricardo declares that he agrees with Destot de Tracy when the latter says, "As it is certain that our physical and moral faculties are alone our original riches, the employment of those faculties, labor of some kind, is our original treasure, and it is always from this employment that all those things are created which we call riches." It is certain, too, that all those things only represent the labor which has created them, and if they have a value, or even two distinct values, they can only derive them from that, the value, of the labor from which they emanate. Ricardo, The Principles of Political Economy, 3rd ed., London, 1821, page 334. We would here only point out that these are the books that appeared, respectively, as Volume 3 of Capital, and Theories of Surplus Value, 3 volumes, Destot de Tracy, Elements d'Idéologie, Parts 4 and 5, Paris, 1826, pp. 35-6. 174 commodities and money within these forms. But it has never once asked the question why this content has assumed that particular form, that is to say, why labor is expressed in value, and why the measurement of labor by its duration is expressed in the magnitude of the value of the product. 34. These formulas, which bear the unmistakable stamp of Ricardo, imposes his own more profound interpretation on the words of Destot. Admittedly, Destot does say that all things which constitute wealth represent the labor which has created them, but, on the other hand, he also says that they acquire their two different values, use value and exchange value, from the value of labor. He thus falls into the commonplace error of the vulgar economists, who assume the value of one commodity, here labor, in order in turn to use it to determine the values of other commodities. But Ricardo reads him as if he had said that labor, not the value of labor, is represented both in use value and in exchange value. Nevertheless, Ricardo himself makes so little of the dual character of the labor represented in this twofold way that he is forced to spend the whole of his chapter, Value and Riches, their distinctive properties, on a laborious examination of the trivialities of a JBC. And at the end he is therefore quite astonished to find that while Destot agrees with him that labor is the source of value, he nevertheless also agrees with Say about the concept of value. 34. It is one of the chief failings of classical political economy that it has never succeeded, by means of its analysis of commodities, and in particular of their value, in discovering the form of value which in fact turns value into exchange value. Even its best representatives, Adam Smith and Ricardo, treat the form of value as something of indifference, something external to the nature 0f the commodity itself. The explanation for this is not simply that their attention is entirely absorbed by the analysis of the magnitude of value. It lies deeper. The value form of the product of labor is the most abstract, but also the most universal form of the bourgeois mode of production. By that fact it stamps the bourgeois mode of production as a particular kind of social production of a historical and transitory character. Then we make the mistake of treating it as the eternal natural form of social production. We necessarily overlook the specificity of the value form, and consequently of the commodity form together with its further developments, the money form, the capital form, etc. We therefore find that economists who are entirely agreed that labor time is the measure of the magnitude of value, have the strangest and most contradictory ideas about money, that is, about the universal equivalent in its finished form. This emerges sharply when they deal with banking, where the commonplace definitions of money will no longer hold water. Hence there has arisen in opposition to the classical economists a restored mercantilist system, Gagné etc., which sees in value only the social form, or rather its insubstantial semblance. Let me point out once and for all that by classical political economy I mean all the economists who, since the time of W. Petty, have investigated the real internal framework, Zusammenhang, of bourgeois. I am sorry to be obliged to add that M. de Tracy supports, by his author ity, the definitions which M. Say has given of the words, value, riches, and utility. Ricardo, Op. Cit. Page 334. The commodity 175 belonging to a social formation in which the process of production has mastery over man, instead of the opposite, appear to the political economist's bourgeois consciousness to be as much a self-evident and nature-imposed necessity as productive labor itself. Hence the pre-bourgeois forms of the social organization of production are treated by political economy in much the same way as the fathers of the church treated pre-Christian religions. 35. Relations of production, as opposed to the vulgar economists who only flounder around within the apparent framework of those relations, ceaselessly ruminate on the materials long since provided by scientific political economy, and seek their plausible explanations of the crudest phenomena for the domestic purposes of the bourgeoisie. Apart from this, the vulgar economists confine themselves to systematizing in a pedantic way, and proclaiming for everlasting truths, the banal and complacent notions held by the bourgeois agents of production about their own world, which is to them the best possible one. 35. The economists have a singular way of proceeding. For them, there are only two kinds of institutions, artificial and natural. The institutions of feudalism are artificial institutions, those of the bourgeoisie are natural institutions. In this they resemble the theologians, who likewise establish two kinds of religion. Every religion which is not theirs is an invention of men, while their own is an emanation of God. Thus there has been history, but there is no longer any. Karl Marx, Misère de fa philosophie. Réponse à la philosophie de fa Misère de M. Proudhon, 1847, page 113. Truly comical is M. Bastiat, who imagines that the ancient Greeks and Romans lived by plunder alone. For if people live by plunder for centuries, there must, after all, always be something there to plunder. In other words, the objects of plunder must be continually reproduced. It seems, therefore, that even the Greeks and the Romans had a process of production, hence an economy, which constituted the material basis of their world as much as the bourgeois economy constitutes that of the present-day world. Or perhaps Bastiat means that a mode of production based on the labor of slaves is based on a system of plunder. In that case he is on dangerous ground. If a giant thinker like Aristotle could err in his evaluation of slave labor, why should a dwarf economist like Bastiat be right in his evaluation of wage labor? I seize this opportunity of briefly refuting an objection made by a German-American publication to my work Zur Kritik der Politischen Ökonomie, 1859. My view is that each particular mode of production, and the relations of production corresponding to it at each given moment, in short, the economic structure of society, is the real foundation, on which arises a legal and political superstructure and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness, and that the mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political and intellectual life. English translation. Karl Marx, The Poverty of Philosophy, London, 1966, page 105. These passages are taken from the preface to a contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, written in January 1859, English translation, pp. 20-21. 176 Commodities and money. The degree to which some economists are misled by the fetishism attached to the world of commodities, or by the objective appearance of the social characteristics of labor, is shown, among other things, by the dull and tedious dispute over the part played by nature in the formation of exchange value. Since exchange value is a definite social manner of expressing the labor bestowed on a thing, it can have no more natural content than for example, the rate of exchange. As the commodity form is the most general and the most undeveloped form of bourgeois production, it makes its appearance at an early date, though not in the same predominant and therefore characteristic manner as nowadays. Hence its fetish character is still relatively easy to penetrate. But when we come to more concrete forms, even this appearance of simplicity vanishes. Where did the illusions of the monetary system come from? The adherents of the monetary system did not see gold and silver as representing money as a social relation of production, but in the form of natural objects with peculiar social properties. And what of modern political economy, which looks down so disdainfully on the monetary system? Does not its fetishism become quite palpable when it deals with capital? How long is it since the disappearance of the physiocratic illusion that ground rent grows out of the soil, not out of society? But, to avoid anticipating, we will content ourselves here with one more example relating to the commodity form itself. If commodities could speak, they would say this: our use value may interest men, but it does not belong to us as objects. What does belong to us as objects, however, is our value. Our own in the opinion of the German-American publication, this is all very true for our own times, in which material interests are preponderant, but not for the Middle Ages, dominated by Catholicism, nor for Athens and Rome, dominated by politics. In the first place, it strikes us as odd that anyone should suppose that these well-worn phrases about the Middle Ages in the ancient world were unknown to anyone else. One thing is clear. The Middle Ages could not live on Catholicism, nor could the ancient world on politics. On the contrary, it is the manner in which they gained their livelihood which explains why in one case politics, in the other case Catholicism, played the chief part. For the rest, one needs no more than a slight acquaintance with, for example, the history of the Roman Republic, to be aware that its secret history is the history of landed property. And then there is Don Quixote, who long ago paid the penalty for wrongly imagining that knight-errantry was compatible with all economic forms of society. The Commodity 177 course as commodities proves it. We relate to each other merely as exchange values. Now listen how those commodities speak through the mouth of the economist. Value, i.e. exchange value, as a property of things; riches, i.e. use value, of man. Value, in this sense, necessarily implies exchanges, riches do not. 36. Riches, use value, are the attribute of man, value is the attribute of commodities. A man or a community is rich, a pearl or a diamond is valuable. A pearl or a diamond is valuable as a pearl or diamond. 37. So far no chemist has ever discovered exchange value either in a pearl or a diamond. The economists who have discovered this chemical substance, and who lay special claim to critical acumen, nevertheless find that the use value of material objects belongs to them independently of their material properties, while their value, on the other hand, forms a part of them as objects. What confirms them in this view is the peculiar circumstance that the use value of a thing is realized without exchange, i.e. in the direct relation between the thing and man, while, inversely, its value is re bz only in exchange, i.e. in a social process. Who would not call to mind at this point the advice given by the good Dogberry to the night watchman Seacole 1 asterisk, to be a well-favored man is the gift of fortune, but reading and writing comes by nature. 38-36. Observations on some verbal disputes in Pole. Econ. Particularly relating to value and to supply and demand. London, 1821, page 16, 37. S. Bailey, Op. Cit. Page 165, 38. Both the author of Observations etc. and S. Bailey accuse Ricardo of converting exchange value from something relative into something absolute. The reverse is true. He has reduced the apparent relativity which these things, diamonds, pearls, etc., possess to the true relation hidden behind the appearance, namely their relativity as mere expressions of human labor. If the followers of Ricardo answer Bailey somewhat rudely, but by no means convincingly, this is because they are unable to find in Ricardo's own works any elucidation of the interconnection between value in the form of value, or exchange value. In Shakespeare's comedy Much Ado About Nothing, Act 3, Scene 3. Chapter 2. The process of exchange. Commodities cannot themselves go to market and perform exchanges in their own right. We must, therefore, have recourse to their guardians, who are the possessors of commodities. Commodities are things, and therefore lack the power to resist man. They are unwilling, he can use force, in other words, he can take possession of them. In order that these objects may enter into relation with each other as commodities,